This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Well, welcome. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate this. I've been on the road for the best part of a year, and I have to say, and I'm not patronizing you when I say this is the biggest crowd for me for the year for one single person, so thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So, and you thought you were here for a slideshow on crop circles. Oh dear. You hate flowers, don't you? You don't like any of them? Not one? Congratulations. Okay, right, before I get going, I just want a quick reminder that the last person who let off a cellular phone during one of my talks was seriously reprimanded. You can tell I used to be in advertising. Someone actually asked me, how does a guy in advertising, and by the way, I wasn't one of those kind of people in advertising. I was actually, I actually had a soul. And I mean, there are good people and bad people in advertising, just like anything. I was actually an art director and a writer for many, many years with some of the world's biggest ad agencies. I developed a conscience the day I started working for NutraSuite, and because we don't keep confidence in creative departments, we're sort of the anarchic group of any company. We got these reports from Russia which told us all about what NutraSuite was all about. At that point, I think I resigned the account and sort of discovered something else, which is basically this wonderful subject, which we'll be discussing this evening. But for me, the funny part of this is that, and you have to have a very good sense of humor working in this angle, the connection didn't really make much sense to me until someone pointed out to me, why is it that you're doing this research into crop circles? And I said, I have absolutely no idea. God ran out of good people, I don't know. And this man said to me, well, think about what you used to do on a daily basis. And I said, okay, well, that's easy. I used to take 40 pages of written information. I used to condense it into a logo or a symbol or a headline. And I used to communicate that concept to a skeptical public. And he says to me, what do you do now? I says, well, I take a symbol, I extract 40 pages of written information, and I still have to sell it to a skeptical public. I just don't get paid that well anymore. So that's life. But what I wanted to share with you this evening was something much bigger than crop circles. It's to do with consciousness and how it's imprinting itself in very special places along our planet. And the story, I'm going to take you on a very long, circuitous route, and it may not seem to make much sense at first, but believe me, it will make sense 2 hours from now. If you've ever gone to Northern Europe and you had a chance to look at the tens of thousands of sacred sites that exist there, you'll come across the subtle imposition of sacred space by an oncoming religion. You'll often come across these wonderful embankments of earth, sometimes supplanted with a brand new building on top of it. And brand new in England means about 2,000 years old, by the way. We carbon date our front doors. You'll often come across this kind of example all over Europe, and particularly in the British Isles. And it's much more than a subtle imposition of a brand new religion over an old sacred practice. There's a much bigger story going on here, which I'm about to go into. Because for me, when I started to look at the etymology and the connection of how this new religion began to usurp the old pagan spaces, it seemed that there's something going on behind the scenes that seemed to utilize a spiritual technology which is very, very old and very, very sacred to our predecessors. In fact, these sacred spaces appear to be much more than the sum of their parts. And one of the first clues that I received was looking into the origin of the word church itself, which can go back to a Nordic word called kirk. And if you ever go to Scotland, you'll still find that many of the towns and villages in Scotland are still called such things as Selkirk and Falkirk. In other words, the church by the river Sel or the church by the river Fall. And when you take that word kirk all the way back into its ancient history, it actually comes from a Greek word called kirkos, which means both circle and the house of the Lord. So that, for me, was a subtle idea, a subtle reminder that there was something else going on in these sacred spaces, these temples, these houses of the holy, as I call them, because something just didn't seem to make sense as I went through history and began to connect the dots in this phenomenon. And by the way, in case we lose the plot here, we are still talking about crop circles, by the way. This is how my journey has evolved from researching these circular temples, and this is basically where it's ended up. Because today, all around the world, we do have this incredible phenomenon taking shape, these brand new circular temples on our landscape. And it's not just an English phenomenon by any means. We now have this in 29 countries. And in fact, a gentleman just approached me at the back there at my table to let me know that they've also appeared in Hawaii, which is the first I've heard of this. So that's 29 and a half countries now. So as you can see, the more the internet reaches out to people, the more people begin to come out with the stories from their predecessors, grandparents, great-grandparents. Even here in North America, this year alone, I've had reports of crop circles this year in Montana. I've heard about crop circles in Amish land in Missouri, which is very unusual, especially when the Amish actually threaten to shoot you if you go anywhere near these devil's circles, as they call them. There's a huge superstition around them. And interestingly, it's a superstition that actually goes back many hundreds of years, because in English culture, and if you go back through some of the records of the Victorian era, you'll find the mention of devil's circles and witches' rings going back to 1890, even 1680. And some of these descriptions, accompanied by eyewitness reports from farmers, do describe very unusual events around these superstitious sites. And by this I mean the fact that the farmers actually witnessed tubes of light coming down from the clouds and imprinting a shape right in front of them within 15 seconds or less. They also describe balls of light flying around the vicinity of these flattened areas of corn, as we call it in England. And again, these balls of light seem to be associated in some way with the sacred temples, of which there are many thousands in this part of the world. So it's certainly not a modern phenomenon by any means. It goes back at least 300 years, but it's only in the modern era that suddenly a lot of interest has actually been given to the phenomenon, to the point where the media took up the tale in the 1980s, and eventually it culminated in this incredible story about two guys called Doug and Dave, who supposedly made every single one of, at the time, 5,000 reported crop circles around the world. I kid you not. On some occasions, they even claimed to have made a circle in one county, while in different counties there were other designs happening on the same night, some of them as long as 600 feet in diameter, and in some cases, they apparently went into different countries in the same evening. All of this while levitating above the wheat, because nothing was ever damaged, and also experimenting with complete invisibility, because some of these circles appeared during daylight in front of eyewitnesses. And I've always kidded with the media and scientists who've debunked this phenomenon at large to say that if these two guys are able to bilocate and levitate and play with invisibility, let's actually study them. You know, I don't know about you, but the last guy I know who could do this kind of stuff was a guy called Jesus Christ. I'd like to be able to do that kind of stuff. You know, better than my day job, that's for sure. But what is unmistakable, and Doug and Dave's story was actually taken apart behind the scenes during many of their conferences and PR exercises around Europe, by which time by the time we gave them all these questions and cross-referenced them and cross-checked their facts, I'm not sure that they even know which ones they'd made and which ones they haven't. They kept regurgitating the same old stories and reworking the stories until nothing actually made any sense. But none of this ever got to the media, as we all know why. But what we are very sure of is that these new temples on the landscape are operating on the same principles that the ancient temples were working on. And in many, many cases, we're actually looking at the same application of geometry. And by this, I'm discussing sacred geometry in principle. They are based upon ancient mathematical codes which were used by our ancestors to build places like Stonehenge. And they also encode universal harmonics, which are all found in natural organisms, including strategic angles of energy upwelling, which are only found at strategic points on every planet in our solar system, specifically the angle 19.47, which any of you are familiar with the work of Myers and Percy in 2/3, which is not an easy book to digest. It's about this thick, and it talks in 15 decimal places most of the way through. We have now found that on most planets of the solar system, the latitude of 19.47 is strategic in the way some kind of energy vortex emanates from the center of the planet, and it creates a disturbance. Here on Earth, we have the Hawaiian chain of volcanoes at 19.47, and there's a disturbance right there. But the main thrust of all of this argument about the real phenomenon, which there is plenty of evidence for, is the fact that plant biologists seem to be completely at odds to explain how an energy source is doing this to plants, because plants are not supposed to behave like this. They're not supposed to be bending at 90 degrees to the vertical, undamaged. As you can see here, this is a classic example of a genuine crop circle plant. This is in wheat. And you can see how it bends just before the first node of the plant, which is the plant's knuckle. Other strange things are also happening in the genuine circles, in that the roots appear to be pointing in the wrong direction, suggesting perhaps that the local gravitational field is also being influenced. Now, if you're a gardener, if you ever take plants out of the ground, you'll also know that the roots should be pointing in this general direction towards the center of gravity. This is what I mean by the fact that the local gravitational field may be influenced. Now, if you influence gravity, you influence time. And studies have actually been done where people have taken synchronized digital quartz clocks, left one back at home, taken one into a crop circle, put the two back together, and lo and behold, anywhere between 5 to 20 minutes are missing between the two timepieces. This is all new research. We don't know where this is going, and I'm just giving you the facts. By the way, I never tell the truth. I always tell facts. And I always make that very clear, because the truth is a very personal thing, and I don't want to give you my particular truth about something. I want to give you as many facts as I can, because then you can make up your own minds, which is the best way to convey information, in my opinion. We've also had a lot of direct information coming from laboratories of the genuine phenomenon, where the energy source has actually implemented itself to a degree where it influences the cellular structure of the receiving material. And in this case, it's a sample that was taken of a control sample of wheat and put next to a sample taken from a crop circle. And these are all blind experiments, by the way. The laboratories have no idea where the plants are coming from, just to make sure that nothing is invalidated. And as you can see, quite visibly, the crystalline structure of the plants taken from the crop circles have been altered in a very, very visually compelling way. And again, this has been done through the work mostly of William Levengood in Michigan, who has analyzed, it must be by now, thousands of samples from plants for over 15 years. It's quite a large body of work. And the evidence keeps building. We've had magnetometer surveys to show that in at least 20% of the crop circles that were actually looked at between the years 1999 and the year 2001 by Colin Andrews seem to suggest that the Earth's magnetic field has also been shifted inside their space. In other words, there's a kind of shielding device which is taking place inside the actual flattened area, where the Earth's magnetic field is deviated by about 4 degrees from normal, as if there's some kind of an interdimensional window taking place here. We've also discovered the effects of ultrasound, which I shall discuss later. Electromagnetism is also being recorded inside the crop circles to a degree where the readings are much higher inside the designs than outside. And also, as I said, we've had the altered magnetic fields. So what on earth is going on here? Well, this is where I want to take you back into history, to about 8000 BC, because without understanding the context in which the crop circles are appearing and why they're appearing where they are, and predominantly in southern England, which is 70% of all reported cases, in the counties of what used to be the old Kingdom of Wessex in England, where we have tens of thousands of sacred sites, standing stones, Stonehenge, Avebury Stone Circle. This is a large conglomeration of sacredness in our land around the world. To understand the historical context in which the crop circles appear, to understand their purpose and what's coming up behind them and why they're appearing now. So I want to take you back on this magical journey to about 8000 BC And look at these ancient temples, these simple mounds that were marking the landscape, because at that time, our ancestors were honoring an ancient tradition of taking care of the land and marking on the land specific points where subtle energy was somehow different. And they marked these places as an insurance policy for our times when we needed this connection to the invisible universe more than ever. Now, to give you an idea of what they were playing with, they were harnessing natural forces to communicate with spirit, because we as a collective consciousness, as a collective human consciousness, undertake an experiment every 4,000 years. And from roughly around 6,000 BC to about 2000 BC, we as a collective consciousness wanted to worship and work with the female principle in life. In other words, all our sacred spaces were working with the lunar principle, the principle that works with our tides, works with all the water molecules on Earth, of which we're mostly composed. And all the temples that you find around the world built around this time were always associated with lunar principles. It was a time of cooperation. It was a time of lack of fear. It was a time of honoring female deity, not just by females, but also by males as well. This wasn't a gender-sensitive subject by any means. Now, at the end of that experiment, 4,000 years later, we decided to go undertake another experience. From what I'm told, from the spirit world, there is nothing else to do in the universe but have an experience. There is no right, there is no wrong, there is no judgment. There are no pearly gates. There's just an experience. There is nothing else to do. Seems a little strange, doesn't it? But this is the information that keeps coming back from different and very reliable sources. So, when we finally understood what it was to work with the female principle in the physical world, we decided to undertake an experiment which runs right up until today. You may have noticed this. I'm talking to the converted. Who am I kidding? The experiment was to give the power away from the many to the few who would control the many via the solar principle. In other words, the unadulterated, overbearing power of the male principle run completely amok. Sound familiar? And that experiment should have been over by any means a couple of hundred years ago. Now, it's interesting that in the last couple of hundred years, we feel that there's a certain assertion of the scientific left-brain principle trying to maintain its hold on humanity much more than ever. And you also begin to realize that at this time in our life, things aren't really making sense. We get a sense of feeling that perhaps, excuse me, we should be changing to a different level of perception. And this is where the crop circles start appearing at the very, very same time. We talk about the cataclysms of 2012, or the potential of, shall I say, because unless we want this to happen, it's not going to happen. Nothing will happen in 2012 unless we really want to, as a greater amount of consciousness. That's what it's all about having free will. So, to a certain degree, the circles are here to try and remind us, to try and wake up our responsibility to the agreement that we gave ourselves 4,000 years ago, that we were here now to complete the cycle. We've experienced what it feels like to give our power away to the few, and it doesn't feel good. It's quite deliberating. So, now the point is to try and move forward to a much more balanced sense of reality, which is to do with the balance of the male and the female, the working of the heart and the mind together. And that's where we're trying to get to. And you'll find, as you talk more and more about the circles and their behavior, that what's happening is that they seem to be waking something up in our conscious, something inside our own DNA, and it's beginning to help us to realize that we're here for something greater than we actually perceive. And we'll come to this later. Now, at the time of this corruption that was taking place, around about 2600 BC, you get signs of this throughout England and Northern Europe, where the sites began to be shut down. And some of these are very, very obvious. If you ever go to a place called West Kennet Longbarrow in England, which is an ancient burial site, except they only buried specific bones there, never the full skeleton, and that's a whole lecture in itself, you'll see that suddenly huge rocks were actually erected in front of the actual entrance to the sacred space, as if someone knew that the time was up where the power of the land, the power of the sacred space was going to be corrupted. Now, the shaman did this en masse around the world. They began to shut down the sacred sites because power is corruptible. Power does not know if it's either right or it's wrong, if it's correct or incorrect. It just is. We are the ones with our intent who then use that power and try to subjugate it to our own particular ego. So the shaman who were taking care of the temples at the time recognized that this was going to happen. They began to shut down the sacred spaces. By the time we get to 640 AD, we have now begun to really experience what it's like to give our power away to the few. And we have the Roman Empire as a great example of what that's like. At 640 AD, that particular point of power was itself in its death throes, because we have the end of this incredible control mechanism around Europe. So on this particular date, they're in trouble. We have millions of people around Europe who have no one to control them. That's not a good thing. We need a mechanism by which to control all of these people. So the Roman Empire, in its last days, decided to come up with a very interesting concept, the Roman Catholic Church. And I want to make a distinction here between Roman Catholic Church and Christianity, because originally, and I'm not having a go at any particular religion, by the way, I'm just stating a fact, and you can check this up for yourself. At the time, 640 AD, the Christians are being persecuted by the Roman Catholics and being liberated from the Roman Catholics by the Muslims. How far have we actually strayed from that today? It's quite incredible, isn't it? I mean, even in my own culture, and my accent betrays my original culture, I'm actually Portuguese by birth. I collect passports for a living. I'm also an American resident alien. I am not 3 foot tall, I'm not grey. So that's part of my thing. I collect passports for a living. But even in my own Portuguese culture, we have the Muslims working side by side with the early Christians, who are actually much more like Celts than anybody else. It was a very honest pagan culture, worshipping things which were called by different names, but had similar principles, and they worshipped side by side. It all made absolute sense. Now, to give you an idea of how this is all working into this big picture, let's suppose for a moment that you actually owned your own Catholic church, okay? And on this particular day, each one of you received a letter from the Vatican, and it gave you very specific instructions. And these instructions, and I'll translate this from the Portuguese text, let no Christian place lights at the temples or stone enclosures. Let no one presume to make lustrations, or to enchant herbs, or to make flocks pass through a hollow of a tree or an aperture of the earth. For by so doing, so he seems to consecrate them to the devil. Now, the work of the devil was anything that was any kind of knowledge that was being pursued outside the strict confines of Orthodox Catholic belief. Now, it was quite obvious that the pagans didn't seem to share the Roman Catholic syndicate's opinion that use of sacred space in any way connected them with the forces of hell, because 300 years after you received this information, they were still visiting standing stones, dolmens, holy wells, sacred groves of trees, and so forth. Why? Because something worked for them. Something at these sites was working for them as it had done for many thousands of years. Well, by the 11th century, Pope Gregory in Rome is tearing his hair out, what little of it he already had. So none of his ideas were basically coming into fruition, so he decided to actually make worship at these sacred sites absolutely illegal. And not just illegal, the penalties that came with worshipping at these sacred sites were quite severe. For example, if you happened to be a woman who was pregnant with child and you wanted to facilitate childbirth, or indeed you had a sick child that you actually wanted to heal, and you took him to a standing stone or a stone circle, if you were caught, you would have to fast for 3 years. Chances of survival extremely slim. Pardon the pun. I told you there's a sense of humor that runs through this. But even despite these incredible penalties, the pagans, and by the way, pagan means someone who lives in the country. So if you all live in the country, you're all pagans. I can't help you if you live in the city. I don't know what that means. Despite these incredible penalties, this still met with incredible resistance, because the pagans were still worshipping these standing stones that they had done for many thousands of years. So, in a complete change of strategy, the Catholic Church decided to do something very radical. They decided to assimilate the sacred sites. And as you can see by this example, they went about doing this with enormous subtlety. And I began to ask myself why. Why, with all that real estate, empty real estate in that part of the world at that time of the, in that particular time, Why didn't they just knock these things down and then go and build their churches elsewhere? Something just didn't, it was nagging me. I wanted to know what was so important about these sacred spaces that they had to impose their will so much on them. Because when you actually went into these particular dolmens, and this is one in Portugal, by the way, these stones are about 22 feet above the ground. It's quite a small sacred space. If you actually go into the cafe next door here, and you get the key to go into this door, good pastries, by the way, great coffee. I'm trying to support my country's budget deficit. Not sure which one. I belong to 3 countries. They all have budget deficits. Never mind, forget that. You go into here, and there's an altar which is actually carved out of living rock, on which stands a statue of the Virgin Mary. Now, you might say, yes, Freddie, that makes a lot of sense, because that's what the Catholic Church was worshipping. But that wasn't what it was all about, because, funnily enough, for the previous 4,000 years at this site, it was the female principle that was being honored. So it seemed to me that someone in the church knew what these sites were all about. And that's where etymology came in really handy, because the clues seem to be evident in the actual language of the buildings themselves. For example, you walk into a church, you're walking through a hole called the entrance. What is it entrancing? It seemed almost obvious. It took me 15 years to figure this out. And why was it that whenever dowsers and anybody working with subtle energy walked across these entrances, they seemed to detect a spiral of energy that upwells from below the ground? It's as if your whole body is being influenced in a very subtle way. Now, you walk through the entrance and you go down a long aisle called a nave. In Latin, that's navis. It's a boat. And you are transported on this boat. You disembark at the other side at a place called the altar. What is it altering? Up until 100 years ago, altars were actually spelled with an E. Very obvious. And why is it that in Europe, predominantly, the old churches and the cathedrals the altars are all built on red granite, one of the world's most energetically powerful rocks, on account of 2 things: the high amount of quartz content in red granite, and 2, the amount of iron. Quartz, or crystalline structure, is very much evident in the bones of the human body, and iron is that red thing that happens inside the blood. It kind of begins to give the clues as to why these places were called what they were. Now, fast forward another 100 years. Now something really mysterious has appeared on the landscape. You're sitting in this dilapidated little thatched cottage made of cob and horsehair and manure, and you go out to take the garbage first thing in the morning, and you look up, my God, there's a Gothic cathedral outside. It's almost as if it would be akin to being in Manhattan in 1650, living in a little wooden shack, and you're looking up and there's the Empire State Building. That's kind of the relationship that was happening at the time. And even more weird was that these things, which took over 60 years to build, were built not only with the finest craftsmen of their period, but they were built at a time when there was war, pestilence, plague, mass unemployment, and low finance. Now, these are not exactly great socio-economic indicators to undertake a huge building period using some of the finest craftsmen in Europe, which honed these buildings to perfection. These are incredible, incredible gifts to sacred geometry and also to sound principles. So, again, it makes you wonder what on earth was going on here, who in their right minds had all this money and the intent and the purpose to build these Gothic cathedrals on top of existing pagan temples. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The people who came up with the money were a bunch of guys called the Knights Templars, who recently have had a very, very bad PR against them. Now, if you trace the origin of the Templars all the way back before the time when they were supposedly created, these were the people who essentially were the shamans of the temple in Egypt. They carried with them, over the course of many hundreds of years, since the demise of the Egyptian cultures, the essence of the Egyptian mystery schools. In other words, they understood about the manipulation of energy, sacred geometry, how to use sound, how to manifest energy and alter its structure. This is the concept behind the actual creation of the Templars, and this is why the mystery schools and the Templars were a secret society. Not because they had to hide something from you, it was because they had to give this information only to people who would use it responsibly. Well, guess what? At the time, all of this knowledge of harnessing the properties of manipulation of energy and matter, they were being guarded by this close group of people who were going to be disintegrated by the Roman Catholic Church in the Vatican and also the Philip V of France. And they created, for the purpose of extinguishing the Templar tradition and extracting the secrets out of them, as well as all their money, they created something called the Inquisition. Now, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. I know a few of you have watched Monty Python. The Templars knew that game was up. They couldn't fight two combined forces of Philip and the Pope at the same time. It was more than they actually had in terms of... they were limited to a certain degree by that amount of political clout. So, knowing full well that the time was up, the Templars concocted an incredibly cunning plan. Some of them who went to Portugal, some of them went to Rosslyn Chapel in northern Scotland, eventually ended up in Nova Scotia, which is another lecture in its own. The ones that stayed behind concocted this great concept to keep the information where it belonged, in the hands of the people. And they left it there for a time when people would be sufficiently aware that they could decode the information. And what they did was they encoded the information in the very buildings of the people that they were out to kill them. It's fiendish. They put the information right under the noses of the Catholic Church. So today, when you look at Gothic cathedrals, and specifically, places like Chartres and Salisbury, you will find that the relationship of all the elements, the positioning of the walls, the altars, the choirs, everything about them, is all in a harmonic relationship to do with sacred geometry and universal principles to do with the manipulation of energy. This is what they were all about. So, along come the Russians in our modern era in the 20th century, and they picked up on this information, and they thought, what if the Templars were actually onto something? What if our pagan cultures, the Egyptians and so forth, actually were onto something with this concept of sacred geometry and planetary harmonics? What would happen if, in fact, there is healing and an influence on the human body? Because when people went into these temples, they were having altered states of awareness. They were having healings. So the Russians, who had no money, decided to actually experiment with all this sacred geometry. And what they found was that when you put sick people into hospital rooms that are shaped like pentagrams, the rate of healing goes up dramatically. When they put schizophrenic patients in trapezoidal-shaped rooms, they found that their rate of healing went up dramatically as well, right to the point where they put blood in spherical shapes and found that the rate of coagulation of the blood increased dramatically. So the Russians helped us to realize that there's something about shape which has a concordant effect on the human body, whose own molecules, when you look at them and freeze them under a microscope, you realize that all the spatial relationships are also held together by an invisible geometric glue. So the Russians were definitely onto something here and trying to prove the fact that the Templars were definitely onto something. But it wasn't just that was in the cathedrals. It was also the fact that there was a strategic use of stone. And this is something that you'll also find when you go to the pyramids in Egypt and many of the temples, that there are specific stones always being used, and they're not necessarily local stone. Sometimes they have to come from a long, long way away. Well, again, in places like Chartres, you'll find the concordant use of limestone and also granite, which in pagan principles are male and female in polarity. This is because one, granite is made from volcanic activity. It's considered to be solar and therefore male. Limestone is considered to be sedimentary in nature. Therefore, it is the action of water laying down tiny little microscopic parts of calcium, I believe. This would associate it with lunar principles and the female principle of life. So, what they basically were doing, the people who created these buildings, was that they were creating a chamber which had an electrical charge. It had an electrical circuit, which is both positive and negative in polarity. Now that's interesting because the human body is also positive and negative in polarity. One of your hands will have one charge, the other hand will have another. So consequently, when you stand in one of these buildings, when you put your hands together in the act of prayer, you're basically connecting an electrical circuit, and you suddenly become much more than the sum of your parts. And this building, this sonic temple, was influencing and enhancing that possibility of all those energies in your body to heal themselves and bring them into a holy order. Now, the guys who put all these buildings together were the Freemasons. Mason breaks down into an interesting word called ma-son, the sound of mother. In other words, the sound of Mother Earth. And again, it shows you that the people who were working with the rock understood the energetic principles of rock. And by putting these things in certain geometric relationship one to another, you would create a sonic framework which would have an effect on the state of awareness of the human body. The Russians also found, by the way, that when you probe people in these Gothic cathedrals and you put little things on their heads to figure out where their brainwaves are going, they found that when it began to play Gregorian chant, which is the kind of pop music of its day, in these buildings, they found that people's brainwave patterns rose about 4,000% above normal waking state. So there's something definitely going on energetically inside these buildings. Now, this is where something doesn't quite make sense to me. Thank you for the vodka, by the way. You cannot convince me for 1 second that you're going to take all of this architecture, 80 years of craftsmanship, all this money, intellectual activity, and then you're going to put these buildings in a place where the ground is architecturally unsuitable for building. Because all of these buildings, without exception, were built on water, or to be more specific, marshland. In other words, they're going to sink. There's something that doesn't quite make sense to me here until you began to look at the actual relationship to water, because every single sacred space that exists in the world, including the pyramids at Giza, all were built on top of underground aquifers, underground watercourses, next to rivers, and so forth. Water seemed to be a vital ingredient in the spiritual technology, as I call it. Well, we know that water is a great conductor of energy and is also able to store memory. And we'll come back to that later at the end of this talk, because it's very important to the relationship to crop circles. Because the other important thing to remember here in this spiritual technology that was being created around the world was the fact that when you apply the spin movement of energy over water, you generate an electromagnetic charge in water. Which brings us on now to the next level of information, spin. Spin is nature's most efficient movement of energy, and we take it so much for granted that when we look up in the sky, we hardly see it anymore. We see it upstairs in the heavens, and we see it down below when we go on a beach. And it's a shape that's basically fundamental to nature. It's so fundamental, in fact, that without the spin motion of energy, blood could not move through the veins of the human body. We'd all be dead, in other words. It's that fundamental. And our ancestors were very much observant about the way that this energy moved in spiral patterns, because they carved this understanding in the stone chambers all around the world. This particular example from Ireland, Newgrange. Again, one of the world's most best preserved stone chambers. Absolutely beautiful, well worth the trip. What a team from Princeton University, the Anomalies research department found when they went to places like Newgrange is that when they went to look at the way that these sacred temples were having an effect on states of awareness, and the way that the myth carried this tradition of working with sound to achieve this state of awareness, they went to places like Newgrange, and they found that when they actually filled these chambers with smoke and they pumped specific frequencies into these chambers, they created standing wave patterns. And they did this throughout the British Isles, and they found this also in Cornwall, in some of the chambers down there. This is one of the mappings that they made. The red dotted lines actually show the actual standing wave patterns inside the actual chamber. What was really interesting for them from their research was the fact that it wasn't just the fact that the chamber seemed to be harmonically tuned resonant cavities, which were having an effect on the vibratory molecule and actions of the human body. It was also the fact that specific frequencies actually generated spirals in the smoke feet away from the actual places in the chambers that had been carved with either spirals or zigzags. So it's as if our predecessors not only created these buildings as initiation spaces, but they also left the instructions carved in the rock for a time when we would need to go back in there and reconnect with the final points of life. And as I said, these hundreds upon hundreds of traditions and mythology in Northern Europe and throughout the world of these temples as being places of invocation, places of healing and heightened states of awareness. And the reason why I brought you on this very long journey, meandering journey, was basically to give you a sense that fundamentally the foundation of every crop circle is based on this same understanding of the spiral. But it's not just any old spiral that's behind the creation of genuine crop circles, because it's a specific spiral that is also fundamental to nature. Because when you look at the way that it's actually mapped out, it's actually a spiral that conforms to the golden ratio. For mathematicians, that would be 5. Now, this is the ratio that nature uses to build all its organisms. The way that plants relate to one leaf to another, the way that trees basically grow, the way that the bones in the human hand relate one to another. It's nature's fundamental building principle. And we find this only in the genuine circles. Not even the ones that I've seen made by people. They cannot recreate this. It's such a very specific relationship to create mathematically. And by the way, if you ever go to England and try to find out the difference between a man-made or a genuine circle, the genuine circles, the center is never directly in the center of the circle. It's always off to one side. That's one way you can tell. But the spiral, or this understanding of spiral by the circle makers, is not just limited to the simple 3-foot circles. It's also evident in many of the large designs. These are people, by the way. Believe it or not. This is 900 feet from point to point to point to point. And it's all made of equilateral triangles, repeating equilateral triangles, spanning out in 3 golden ratio curves. And again, constructed in the shortest evening of the winter, about 4 hours in England this time of the year, allegedly by 2 guys of 65 and 63 years of age who levitated above the wheat, and no one saw them because they were invisible. Makes you wonder, doesn't it, what goes on out there? And we too, in the crop circle phenomenon, have now hundreds of compiled case histories as well of people experiencing heightened states of awareness in crop circles, including skeptics and farmers, who, by the way, are no-nonsense people. Farmers are out to make crops and grow wheat and so forth. They're not into entertaining a supernatural phenomenon. So when they start reporting unusual effects, you better pay attention, because they really don't do this very willingly. We also have cases where people have actually experienced healing in association with the circles, either by entering them, by ingesting the wheat, or in a case which I've been involved with recently, not far from where I now live in Portland, Maine, just to confuse the issue. Just outside Portland, Maine, a friend of mine told me that her neighbor was dying of cancer. She'd actually been sent home to die with dignity. She had literally been given a week left to live. And she asked me about the healing ability of circles, and I said, well, actually, they don't contain healing ability as such. They can contain mathematical, geometric, and energetic codes, which actually the human body will choose to actually work with if it wants to heal itself. It's the meeting of 2 like minds, and I can tell you how to do it. And to cut a very long story short, just by using a picture, a photograph of a crop circle, and putting water, spring water on top of this, and giving the water to the patient, within 1 month, her cancer was gone. She was out driving, getting the groceries, etc. She was having a normal functional life. Now, this is where the story has a rather sad ending, because the whole process of the fact that this woman, who, I don't know what her religious background is, and it may have an effect on the outcome, I don't know. She literally is on the deathbed right now. It's the fact that the concept of a crop circle helping her to heal herself so frightened her to such a degree where she stopped actually taking the medication. She became so fearful of this power over her that she actually stopped doing the communication. This is why the crop circles and the human consciousness are integrated. They're not here to fulfill or to help in terms of curing everything. They are here to give you a concept, and you work with that concept at will. We are part of the actual equation. But it does show you the potential, the incredible potential that these things have. Now, to move forward a little bit, and still on the concept of spirals, when you give this spiral movement of energy 3-dimensional form and you freeze it in 1/1,000,000th of a second, you get this kind of shape. It's something called a tube torus, and basically it is the primary movement in the generation of matter. In fact, the tube torus, this concept of where the atoms run around each other in very, very fast space, in and out of each other, almost like a donut, it underlies the structure of molecular life itself. And sometimes the crop circles appear to be giving us this information, because when you slice this like an orange and you cut it, this is the kind of picture that you end up with. And every summer, Each summer has a different lesson to be given to the research community. It's as if every year there's a lesson to be learned, and they keep doing this year after year after year. And when you look back at the information in retrospect, it seems as if we've been given a very large volume of information. It's almost scarily close to the film Contact, if anybody of you are familiar with that film. They're giving you a reference library. They're acquainting us also, or reacquainting us with universal principles which have held civilizations in perfect balance for thousands of years, and God knows we need it right now. So all of this information, this new information that we've been provided with in the blueprints and the fields is very, very timely. And the subconscious connection is also very timely, at a time when we do need that spiritual connection to try and help us through this tumultuous period in our history. And this is a particular case in point, where only hours before it was revealed to the world that indeed inside this space of crop circles, the magnetic field of the Earth is shifted 4 degrees. This crop circle appeared to only miles away from the venue where it was being revealed to validate that theory. And I'll say this because of these 11 segments of the flattened area, of this torus shape, by the way. I think I'm losing my battery. Never mind. Yes, I'm losing my battery. I'm losing my batteries. I nearly did my Sean Connery thing there. Never mind. I'm going to go over here. I have a mic I can walk with. If you take the edge of this design here and you shift it exactly 4 degrees, rotate it clockwise, you get to this edge here. This is why the fact that I mean that this design actually shows you the concept of the shift in 4-degree magnetic field. And there's a second one right here. You're a gentleman and a scholar, thank you. What happens if I press the other buttons?
It'll turn off the video.
Excellent. Better make sure I get it right then. Right. So it's as if someone was actually sort of almost feeding us information, because I know from my own experience that a lot of the stuff that I've written in my own book seems to have just been downloaded, because a lot of the stuff that I've written about is so way and above my normal intellectual appreciation that sometimes it's scary where this stuff is coming from. And I've heard many, many people say this exact same thing. And the same can be said of the fact that the information, when we do finally put it on a piece of paper, is validated on the ground, either within minutes, just prior to, or within a day of us coming out with information. There's a two-way process of communication taking place here. It's almost frightening in some ways, but in a very positive way. But again, it shows you that there is new information being given to us about the way that perhaps the crop circles are pointing us to a new technology. I say this also because there are references in many of the glyphs to this 4-degree dimensional shift. Now that we know the information is there, validated at a scientific level, we can go back in time, back to 1991, for example, and show that even in the ratchet design of this famous Barbary castle glyph, which many people are taken by, you can see that when we did the original measurements, the 4-degree shift in magnetic field is also there as well. So we're now going back and re-evaluating a lot of this information. And as I said earlier, this also encodes, for example, if you ever take a look at this picture, and it's in the front cover of my book, many skeptics will point out that this was actually a hoax because there was an error here, okay? Never mind that in the previous night when it was actually created, balls of light were seen hovering in the field by farmers and many people walking in the middle of the night. We were crazy people in England. We walk out in fields in the middle of the night, walking dogs. They pointed out that there's an error in this design because this straight line is actually bent right there. Well, what they don't tell you is that that line is bent at exactly 19.47 degrees, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the degree of latitude on our planet where a sphere, which is circumscribing a tetrahedral shape, in other words, a tetrahedron is spinning beyond our normal level of perception at billions of cycles per second, is giving the illusion that we're actually living on a sphere. I mean, many people have actually pointed out to this technology before. But the point is that wherever those points of the actual tetrahedron hit the surface or touch the surface of a sphere which circumscribes it, that degree of latitude is always at 19.47 degrees. And here on Earth we have the Hawaiian chain of volcanoes. On Venus you have the big volcano. On Mars you have the shield volcano. And in Jupiter you have the red spot. So all of this information appears to be coded very deliberately into the crop circles too. What is also interesting about this 4-degree shift in magnetic field, I believe at the moment, and I'm still working on this premise, is that perhaps they're showing us a time that there is an interdimensional window where information is able to enter the Earth and also leave it. And part of my proof and belief behind this is because most crop circles appear between the hours of 2 and 4 a.m., no matter where they appear in the world. Now, this is the time, the specific location on our Earth, which is shielded from the angle of the sun. And it also means that it's the time of night when the Earth's magnetic field is at its lowest ebb. In other words, it's having a little sleep. Now, interestingly, 2 to 4 a.m. is also the time where 95% of all reported hospital deaths occur. It seems as if what they're showing us here is an interdimensional window where information enters the Earth and also allows us to leave. This is all being worked on right now. If anybody out there has a few $1 billion of money for research, I'd like to have it. It's an expensive phenomenon. Now, let's go back to those movement of energy, all those molecules and the spiral movement of energy, because when you put them all together like God's glue, you end up with these big molecules, the planets. And there's nothing very special about this and very unusual about this, because we were taught this in school. But to the ancients who were studying the heavens, they took these big molecules as living, vibrating organisms, to the point where even the Greeks referred to the planets as acousmata, the resonant ones, showing to the degree in which they believed that sound or vibration or resonance at some stage was fundamental in the creation of the physical universe. They were in fact so enamored with the planets that they began to measure their orbits. And they were very surprised to find that when you took the eccentricities of the orbits and you put them into mean ratios, that something very interesting and elegant was taking place from one relationship to another in the planets. And this is where the concept of sacred geometry suddenly came to light, because the world of perfection of the gods in the heavens, where each one of those small molecules was going around each other in this perfect harmonic relationship. So, for example, when you see here that the orbits, the mean orbits between Mercury and the Earth are defined perfectly by a pentagram, and so on and so forth. And this is why they took great interest in this geometry, and why, when the Egyptians came along, they applied this geometry liberally throughout all their temples. This is why when we go to Egypt, we are drawn to specific temples, because each one of them is incorporating invisibly different aspects of this solar geometry. If you ever go to Luxor, by the way, you get the great privilege of having the choice between two temples. You have Luxor on one hand, which is this, a beautiful temple which is encoding female principles. And if you ever want to work with sound, dance, or anything to do with the female side of life, this is where you go. Well, surprise, surprise, this is full of encoded pentagrams, which is always the female principle in life because it's associated with the lunar cycle. If you want to go and experience the male energy, you go across the road to Karnak. Even the name itself has that energy of maleness to it. And there you'll find not only the rocks are totally different and come from a much more male polarity, because they're mostly dolerite and granites in there, they also encode the relationship of the hexagon, which is always associated with the principles of solar deities. So again, you had this interplay and specific use of geometry inside the temples to achieve and influence the human body and its state of awareness. My lovely trip to Egypt. This is just again to prove the point of this encoded geometry in these temples. This is the work primarily of Schwaller de Lubbock's. If you ever want to really get your head buried deep into the relationship of Egyptian temples, he is the man. Not to put too lightly a word on that, he really gave up his life and he dedicated his entire career to understanding these spiritual concepts that the Egyptians were playing with. But the Egyptians were also very interested about locating their temples in strategic points, and for this, they didn't just go around the Nile and pick a nice bend where there were palm trees and dancing girls and said, what a great place for a temple. They basically took with them people who understood subtle energy, and they were able to douse magnetic lines of energy that crisscrossed the landscape all around the world. And where these two lines crossed, and they formed a node point, this is where the original stone for the altar was placed for the temple, because something was altering the human body at a subtle level. All that magnetism crossing on the land was having an effect on the iron of the blood and the magnetite, which exists right here behind the two eyes in the skull. Something was influencing people's state of awareness, and this is why they built their temples exactly where they were. So the harmonics that were put into the rocks, into the relationship of and the positioning of all their temples was very important for achieving a resonant environment, very much like a Gothic cathedral. And of course the other thing that the Egyptians encoded into their temples was also the golden ratio, linking now the relationship of life to crop circles and also to Egyptian temples and other places of worship. Now the predecessors of the Egyptians called these sacred sites Betilu in the Iberian Peninsula. And Betilu comes from Cymatics. It's a word called Beth El, the house of God. These, for the ancestors, were the house of God. Now Beth El, of course, gives us the wonderful town called Beth El-Ham, where a very interesting guy was born 2,000 years ago. Nothing new under the sun, it seems. But again, you've got to ask yourself, why did these people move 300-ton rocks over hill, over streams, over dales, over mountains? Because some of these rocks are not local to the environment. If you ever go to, let's see, southern England, some of those rocks had to be carted all the way from Wales. That's over 100 miles over some very treacherous territory, and that's just in a 4x4. There was a lot of trouble that they went to move these rocks, and again, you have to ask yourself why. Well, in another part of the Iberian Peninsula, these places were actually called anta, which comes from Latin, annotare, which means to mark or locate. So, just like the entrance and the altar, what were they marking? What were they locating? Well, over 100 years of research done by dowsers and people working with subtle energies has found that every single temple of antiquity, no matter where it is in the world, including here in the United States, and by this I'm talking about the ancient Native American burial sites, is the fact that wherever they are placed, they are harnessing the crossing lines of magnetic, of invisible, yet dowsable and measurable lines of magnetic energy. The example here on the right is Avebury Temple, the largest stone circle in the world, in England. And you can see how a positive charge line and a negative charge line of energy cross the site as strategic lines, as strategic points to influence the area of the site. And the rocks were basically placed there to anchor these lines into place, almost working as an acupuncture of the earth to make sure that these energies did not fluctuate like serpents moving across the countryside. They put these temples exactly where they were as an insurance policy for our time. And nowadays, with the time that we've lost most of the connection to our spiritual culture, we find a greater amount of people visiting these sites more than ever. So something is definitely waking up here. Something that was actually shut down over a couple of thousand years ago. Something is waking in the land. To give you an idea also of what's happening in the relationship of these temples, these standing stones, places like Stonehenge. This is a dowsing map which I undertook of the actual stone circles and the standing stones, to give you an idea that there's something else going on energetically at these sites, and possibly why our ancestors went through a lot of trouble not only to build them, but also went through a lot of trouble to try evade detection at great cost to them, because the penalties for going to these places were very, very severe, as we found out earlier. Well, what I'm showing you here are basically the dowsable ripples of energy which are emanating from a standing stone, just as an example. And you can see from all of these rings of energy going around and vibrating all around the landscape, how each one of them relates to one to another, not haphazardly on the land, but each one is linked one to another by this wonderful relationship called sacred geometry. And it's not just any old geometry, it's the pentagonal geometry, it's the hexagonal geometry of the heavens. And this is a very important principle and gives us a great understanding as to why people went to these sites. Because when you take human DNA, you put the crystalline structure under a microscope and you look at the way the helix is actually bonded together, you look at the crystalline structure of human DNA and it's bonded together one to another with crystals which are based on pentagrams and hexagrams. What you're looking at here is basically your own body. And it leads me to believe that we went to these places because we were having a beneficial effect on the land, and also we were dragging that beneficial effect onto our bodies and our state of consciousness. We were basically looking in the mirror. And this is why people went through a lot of trouble to build these places of worship. And it wasn't just the fact that these places held together this wonderful acupuncture of energy in the land. It was also the fact that there were magnetic anomalies taking place at these sites, even to this day. Even distortions in time have been reported in some of these standing stones and also in the stone circles around Britain. To begin to put all this now together, come back to the concept that the churches, the cathedrals were built on top of these sacred sites. So the energy of the land is already contained on the particular situation of the land. When you begin to imprint the walls of the cathedrals on top of them, something quite magic begins to occur because you're now harnessing what is already quite evident on the landscape. This is a blueprint of Salisbury Cathedral in England, built on over 4 feet of groundwater. The building literally is just floating on water. It's quite an incredible feat. But you can see here how there are 2 almost straight lines of energy, of magnetic energy that cross the land. And you can see how the actual way that the walls are put together actually echo the intensity of the energy in the land. They give the whole purpose of the relationship of the walls a whole new meaning. And X definitely marks the spot, unlike Indiana Jones when he said, X never marks the spot. Well, now it really does. It does give the cruciform shape of the buildings a whole new meaning. Now, under here, underneath the spire, which is a perversion of the word spiral, by the way, you get to see a concentration of energy which is rippling out across the land, just like a stone circle or a needle of stone. And the other most important thing to bear in mind is the way that the entrances were located over these underground deposits of water, which are denoted by these blue lines. These are underground water lines, which are all carrying electromagnetic energy on the land. As I said earlier, when you put spin, motion of energy, and also intent, by the way, you begin to actually add electromagnetic frequency to water. You can see how the whole thing was strategically built to make the best use of underlying forces of nature. This is pretty much the main reason why the pagan sites were assimilated, and it was for our own benefit. Let me just build all of these things up now into a common thread here, so we can keep a sense of perspective. We've so far discussed the concept of sacred geometry at sacred temples. We've discussed the use of magnetism on the sites. We've discussed the use of sound used in these temples as well, and also the movement of spin and the implementation of water, which we'll get to much later. Now, all of these things are creating resonant effect on the human body because we too are basically vessels of molecules in a vibratory motion all the time. So what these temples are essentially doing are providing an environment that alters the state of awareness of the human body and allows it to come closer to the realm of God itself. And I'll say itself as well. And the reason why I bring all of this together is because there is a huge historical association taking place between sacred space and also the crop circles, because no matter where you go around the world, in 29 countries, you will find that the crop circle will always associate a local sacred space. Even here in North America, specifically in Ohio, where we have quite a good concentration of reports these days, and we are finding that whenever the crop circles appear, usually simple circles these days, but whenever they appear, they will inevitably appear beside ancient mounds, ancient burial sites, the Serpent Mound in Ohio. Even in California, we find that the circles appearing what now are, or where they used to be, sacred spaces as well, which have since been plowed under into shopping malls and all kinds of things. Same thing happens in the Canadian prairies too. People will email me from Alberta and say, well, we've had a crop circle, but there are no sacred spaces anywhere to be seen on the prairie. And my suggestion is, well, go back to, say, 1890. Look at the library records. Let's see what the people who moved there found when the pioneers moved into the area. And lo and behold, weeks later, they say, yes, in fact, only 100 yards away from this new crop circle, there used to be a Native American burial mound, which has since been cut down by the farmer. So there's something that these circle makers wanted us to focus in. And there are many, many relationships taking place here, and I'll give you just a few. In this particular case, and this is Avebury Stone Circle in England, by the way, or what's left of it, it's the world's biggest stone circle. There used to be over 55 stones going around its perimeter. Huge, huge stones, by the way. And there were 2 smaller circles, one here and one here, all of which gave you all the exact numerical references to the moon and all its movements. It was a real astrological and astronomical calendar. Just down the road here, about a mile or so away, is the remains of a very old stone circle, which is no longer there. You have to go back to maps of the Victorian era to find out where it actually is. And when you actually draw a perfectly straight line through the center, the energy center of that circle and this energy center and this crop circle, they are all in perfect ley alignment. That was the first clue. The second clue that we realized that they were trying to focus on our ancient history was that the symbolic nature was also evident in the designs, because here the lunar principle was worshipped at this site for 4,000 years, and symbolically the spider's web was also associated in pagan cultures to the lunar principle. So whoever was behind this knew the history of the sacred site, and we can multiply these cases by the 100. Now, this being in England, of course, it has its own pub in the center of the crop circle. We call it a research facility. And it facilitates. We imbue the water. But all of this goes beyond the symbolic knowledge of the site, because over the past 20 years of combined research into crop circles shows that they are much more than the sum of their parts as well. Because when you start looking beyond the obvious symbol, what happens is, I'm going to get a shark on you. What happens is that there are encoded mathematical principles and new geometric ratios taking place inside their space. Gerald Hawkins, who passed away recently, good colleague of mine, he was actually a professor of mathematics and also of Boston University as an astronomer. He actually decoded Stonehenge in our modern era, very famous man. He was the first to actually figure out that there are encoded mathematical ratios taking place inside these designs. In this particular case, he actually found Ptolemy's theorem of chords embedded in his design. Now, I went to college. I think I'm a reasonable, smart guy. Does anybody else here know about Ptolemy's theorem of chords? Okay, prove the point. And Gerald actually did something very clever, because he said, let's take this from the most logical point of view, that the crop circles are man-made, because that's what the skeptics want us to believe. And by doing this, by actually looking at the crop circles and extracting this information, and 5 previously unknown mathematical theorems, which should be in the treatises of Euclid, the man in 300 BC, I believe, in the Greek era, whose 13 treatises on mathematics form the basis of our understanding today. There is a gap in his logic where these 5 crop circle theorems ought to be, and he left them out. This is very clever on Gerald's part, because what he did was he raised the intellectual profile of whoever was behind these designs. And he said to me that there's only 0.004% of the entire population of the planet that would then have that kind of intellect to create these. And those are university professors. And I don't think, and I quote, that the university professors, as badly paid as they are in England, are going out making these things in the middle of the night. So that was a very sort of developed concept in terms of trying to figure out what was really behind this. Well, we've since come a long, long way, because we've also found that inside the crop circle spaces there are electromagnetic signatures which are not evident outside their actual space. And again, reported effects on awareness. Raised right brain activity is very important in crop circles, specifically a shutting down of the logical functions of the brain. This happens to hundreds and hundreds of people. As I said before, we have healings, and we also have the distortions in time. All of this is happening to some degree by the invisible information encoded in the designs themselves. This is apart from the energetic stuff that's going on. And I say this, and I give you a couple of examples here, because sometimes when we see a crop circle, we are very much enamored with the picture, and something seems to vibrate or resonate with our being, as if we're actually looking in a mirror to a certain degree. And I believe this is actually very true, because what you're actually seeing here is much more than the sum of its parts, because when you actually connect the dots of this crop circle, this is actually what you're actually experiencing. Not bad, is it? These things are encoding harmonic relationships, again expressed by this thing called sacred geometry. And you can see how near perfect this all is. It's all about universal harmonics. I'll give you another example here. The classic symbol of the Celtic cross, also known as the carbon atom, which is the very symbol of humanity itself. What's going on here is really quite dramatic, where all of these circles and thin rings are all held together in perfect equilibrium by this wonderful array of nested hexagonal geometry. Now again, these are fundamental universal principles that we're seeing here, and it is the pentagram and the hexagram that once again come to the fore in crop circle research. I want to make a very good point about this because this is a very important relationship that's taking place here. This pentagram-hexagram relationship, which numerically is a 5 to 6 relationship. The 5 to 6 relationship is fundamental to a planet for creating life. Without that relationship, a planet cannot hold life. This comes from the work of Percy and Myers in a book called 2/3, if anyone wants to check this up. And I think NASA has now confirmed this as well. The way this works, the way this equation works is the 5 to 6 relationship is by taking the 25,000, I'll round this off, 25,600 years of the Earth's precessional cycle, in other words, the wobble of the Earth at the pole, in relationship to its circumference at the equator in nautical miles. That is the universal harmonic that allows life to be established on a planet. And we're seeing this in the crop circles, and we also see it reflected in our own human DNA. So all of this seems to be relating the crop circles in some way appear to be relating themselves to natural organisms, if nothing else. Here's an overt example of that sacred geometry, nested pentagrams. Record number of about 34 people who experienced heightened states of awareness in this crop circle alone, leading us to believe that perhaps the Pythagoreans were also right when they employed the pentagram as the symbol of healing as well. And that was only a couple of thousand years ago. We're seeing here now the kind of effects that we kind of hear and see about in Gothic cathedrals too. And part of that, again, is also to do with the way that the actual design is working on the land. Now, I showed you before an aerial dowsing map of the ripples of energy around a stone circle and a standing stone. What you see here in these 4 ripples of energy are an energy field which is actually vibrating outside the actual physical design. These things actually don't exist in real life. You can't, the only way you can see them is if you're there first thing in the morning, and I mean really first thing in the morning, about 5 a.m., and you're standing in the field and the wheat is very, very wet, and you can just see these very thin bands of energy trapped in the actual water molecules of the wheat heads in the dew. There's very thin, dark bands along the wheat when it is backlit against the sun. It's there 1 minute, the next minute it's gone. It's very, very magical. But I began to map these things as well to find out if these crop circles perhaps are living organisms too. And what I've discovered is this, yes, they are, because they are vibrating like ripples along the land. And even people walking a mile away can even pick up these things if they're very sensitive. And what you're seeing here on the right is a very, I can always appreciate this is very difficult to point out in a lecture because you have to sit there and measure everything out. But you can just about appreciate that the actual positioning of those 4 ripples of energy are there exactly in relationship to the actual extension of the physical design. I mean, look at that. That pentagram expanded outwards hits exactly where that line of energy is. And even the relationship between the positioning of the ripples of energy can be defined by a perfect pentagon. These are all, again, harmonics. And it gives us a sense that perhaps the crop circles are living, breathing organisms. The energy signature of the crop circle can also be detected not just on the ground, but also below. I showed earlier a slide about the magnetometer survey, which shows that when you put a magnetometer over the crop circle, the actual energy of the design seems to be repeated well below the ground as well. There seems to be an ethereal imprint that is also happening below the ground. Well, guess what? This energy has now been discovered also above the actual designs themselves, because pilots, when they fly over the crop circles at specific times, they'll report a very agonizing and worrying display of red warning lights in their equipment. Their gyroscopes don't stop spinning around like mad. Even the compasses can't find north properly. And some of them have actually stopped flying over the airspace of these things themselves. They do get a little bit concerned, and we understand why. This is a diagram of the kind of thing that you would see with the naked eye if you could see this energy field. Hundreds of photographers have flown over these designs, including myself, and I've been a professional photographer for 15 years. And I can tell you that when you have 3 cameras fail simultaneously, that is very rare, especially when the actual circuit board of the cameras are fried. I took my camera once to a laboratory in England. After I shot, I flew over one of these designs, and I have on a strip of film every single image shot towards the crop circle, flying around the crop circle, and exiting the crop circle. But every shot that was taken right over the very bullseye, there is nothing there, complete blank. After that, the camera stopped working, never again. I took it to my camera repair technician, and I said to him, what's going on here? And he said, well, I don't know where you've been, but the circuit board is absolutely fried. I mean, did you put this in a microwave oven? Were you at several airports in one day? And I said to him, actually, I flew over a crop circle. And he gave me this look that English people usually give them when they don't believe you, which is... They're very serious. He said, normally, sir, I would laugh in your face, but today I won't. And I said, why? Because over there, in that box, there are 4 more cameras. They've all had their circuit boards fried. They've all come from crop circles. And I said, would you like to be part of the research? He said, absolutely. It's a very sure way of knowing that you're on the right path of inquiry. So it's a very expensive phenomenon, especially when you consider that a busload of 13 Japanese tourists all took their video cameras inside the crop circle, and all their cameras never worked after that. It's a very expensive phenomenon. If you ever go into one of these things, do never ever place any electronic equipment on the ground. It's almost as if it grounds the entire circuit. So just in case. So the implications are now are beginning to be quite dramatic, because it wasn't just the fact that the crop circles were appearing in proximity of the sacred spaces, but they also exhibited their own energy form just like a sacred space. The crop circles themselves were appearing along the actual same lines of energy that occupy the local sacred sites. This is Windmill Hill in England. You can see here the old tumuli. They're called tumuli, but there's no one buried there. I mean, of 95% of all tumuli excavated, only 5 have skeletal remains. So you've got to ask yourself again, why are they there? Well, in this case, this is a pretty good example to show you how the actual crossing lines of energy, which go, these here are going north-south and going east-west, you can see how the actual diameter of the crop circle is defined by the very width of the magnetic field lines at that particular spot on the Earth. And these lines, by the way, are everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Came across 2 of them today in a gorge not far from town. But you can see also here in this diagram how the lines are related to the local sacred space. Not just by actual relationship, but by polarity as well, because these also have an electrical circuit attached to them. Some will be positively charged, some will be negatively charged, some have a neutral charge. They are an electrical circuit. So no wonder you as an electrical circuit walks into these things, you are walking into a rarefied energy field, and of course no wonder you're going to feel something operating along your skin, along your body, along your brain waves, because your brain waves are also electrical. All of these things are not only having an effect on natural organisms, but going back to our story about an hour ago, these things were closed down 2,000 years ago for a specific reason. And guess what? These crop circles, these new temples, are opening and influencing information. They're inputting information into the Earth's magnetic field, almost like a magnetic cassette tape. And they're talking to the local sacred site. And all of a sudden, people are going to these sacred sites en masse. And if you're in England, you'll understand this very well. The influx of foreign visitors over the last 10, 15 years is exceptionally dramatic, exceptionally unnoticeably so. Now, the big question, you can see all these question marks on top of everybody in the room. What on earth is creating these crop circles, right? I'm going to give you a sort of a 5% concept of what I've written about in my book, and that is that I very much believe that sound is a prime creative force behind the crop circles, among other things. But I'm going to stick to sound to try and simplify things. And for me, the concept of working with the sonic principles of life were very natural, because I was a musician by trade. Not a very good trade, which led me to actually get involved in this. But every time I kept looking at one of these images, I wasn't actually seeing a geometric shape. I was seeing sound. And it didn't make sense to me at the time, because I've learned all of this from scratch. And I began to look at the effect of religious texts and how every single religion seems to be at odds with itself and each other. But the one thing that religion really does agree on, the one thing that they actually stop arguing about, is that in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God. So fundamentally, what religion is telling us all, no matter where it comes from, is that in the beginning, some creative force has emanated some kind of vibration, and that vibration, in the form of possibly sound, has had a creative effect on the molecular structures of the physical world. Well, the Hindus even acknowledge this, many thousands of years ago, because their science and philosophy are based on the science of vibration, and they even have a name for this, Nada Brahma. It means sound God. So I thought, if you're going to go down this line of inquiry, we'll go down the line which is of least resistance. I have Capricorn rising in my astrological chart. I have to get to the bottom of something, and I like to go for the line of least resistance to get to that little center of truth and of fact. So I began to go down this line of inquiry, and immediately the clues began to pop up out of the fields themselves. What you're seeing here is actually a hieroglyph. It's the hieroglyph of divine vibration. And in a way, if you squint, you can see how this would be symbolic of the pursed lips, and at the edge of the lips there are two energy lines, as if something is bringing out sound by the use of lips. If you're into biology, by the way, this could mean something completely different. It could actually resemble the centrosome of the dividing human cell. And both of you would be absolutely correct. In fact, the crop circle symbols are actually multi-layered in their meaning. You'll find 10, 15, 20 different levels of meaning. And it's always been said that the sign of an advanced civilization lies in its ability to encode a volume of information in a short amount of space. In other words, a symbol. And the Egyptians were very much, definitely the last people who were able to do that on this planet. Now, back to sound for a second. This is a picture of Moses, captured on a digital camera. He's a great poser. Up on Mount Sinai. He always goes for this classical pose, He never, give me something new. No, the classical pose. Amazing what he catch on digital equipment these days. The point here is that Sufi tradition has a wonderful story of God imparting the relationship between sound and consciousness to Moses when he's sitting up on Mount Sinai one day. And I'll read this word for word. Musa ke, Moses, hear, said God. And Moses heard God say how he had made man out of clay, then invited the soul to enter. A free spirit by nature, the soul feared being tied down to such a dense and limiting vessel, and so refused to enter the body. And so God asked the angels to sing, and with their intoxicating melody, the soul was guided to enter the body. Needless to say, Moses had the revelation of a universe constructed by sound, which he named Musake, which we today take for granted as music. So this is the connection between consciousness, spirit, and something imprinting itself on earth. So, taking that as a clue, I began to look at the sound association to crop circles. And the clues, as I said, began to pop up all over the place. The first, one of the first ones was the actual symbolic connection to music or sound. And that is the heptagram, the seven-pointed geometric figure, which basically is representative and symbolic of the pure notes of the music scale, the Western music scale. In other words, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do of the white notes on the piano, the eights, of course, being the octave. What is unusual about this particular design is the fact that when I sat there one afternoon with a friend of mine who's a very well-regarded psychic and another colleague of mine, we actually heard audible notes coming from everywhere but nowhere. They seemed to be right behind your ear, but yet they weren't. It was furtive. It was just untouchable. And it was almost like an angel singing to you in a very, very high pitch. So we managed to record this on a magnetic tape, take it to a local record library, and we got a piano out, tuned to concert pitch, and found that we could actually reproduce the notes we'd actually recorded on the tape. And sure enough, they actually corresponded to the white notes on the piano. And it was something like FGC, FGC, repeating over and over and over in a very, very high pitch. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. We've now heard notes in a crop circle, but what does it mean? I mean, we looked around, by the way, for ice cream vans, people with ghetto blasters. There's nothing around. I mean, this is an agrarian part of England. Very few people actually live in this part of the world. So I went back to New Hampshire in Portsmouth, where I was living at the time, and I wanted to find out what the connection was here, because obviously we'd recorded something which is of great interest. And at this time, books began to fly out of library shelves, and I mean sometimes literally flying out of library shelves. And one of them was on Greek geometry, which, oh boy, I said, I hate geometry, I hate maths, I never wanted to study this at school, why do I have to do this now? It's a cosmic joke. And a very bad one at my expense. But what I came across in this particular book on Greek geometry was this myth of something called the Web of Athena. Now, the Web of Athena, which is this, has a wonderful story behind it too, because it actually describes the actual way in which you can actually connect to the spirit world by using geometry. And the myth goes that this incredible seven-pointed figure, which ironically is the framework for that crop circle I just showed, it's made exactly from only 3 lengths of lines, these 3. And the myth goes that when you take those 3 lengths of line and you position them on a string instrument like a lyre, you can actually play the notes that connect you to the world of the gods. So I thought, well, I don't have a lyre around, but I do have a guitar. So I transposed these 3 lengths of lines onto my guitar and was able to recreate the very same notes that we'd heard in a crop circle, albeit a lower frequency. So now what we had here, in essence, was a geometric form creating a harmonic expression of vibration. So this is a pretty good start, I thought, in the connection to sound. Then I began to look at the relationship of some of the dowsing maps I began to make over the years to see if there was a connection there. This particular one, it shows the ripples of energy vibrating outwards until they reach a certain peak in the land. In fact, it's almost like as if it's created its own bell. You suddenly hit a point where there are 32 very thin rings of energy in a very short space of time. You've hit this incredible tunnel. And I put this on a map, mapped it all out very carefully to within about 3 to 4 inches of discrepancy, which when you're dealing with a diameter of over 900 feet is actually pretty accurate. And I found that there was a relationship taking place here, which was defined. The edge of this energy field relative to the actual physical design was defined by a perfect equilateral triangle. The relationship to music here is that the equilateral triangle in mathematics is a 3-to-1 ratio, and in music, that's a double octave. So now the energy field itself was talking music and sound as well. So the fertile path carried on and on. And one day, a very unusual and bizarre crop circle appeared in the landscape. The first time that this ever appeared, back in 1989, led Gerald Hawkins to go, that's interesting. The plants aren't bent at the ground as they usually are. They've actually been flattened 6 inches from the top of the seed head. Very unusual. And that first time led him to actually discover the first crop circle theorem. And I thought, I wonder, because they've done it again here, is there something unusual about this shape which is telling me something about sound? Because that's where my mind was at the time. As it was for this guy. What the hell's going on here? What you're seeing here basically is about 8,000 square feet of barely impressed barley. And this basically is a very unusual shape because what you're looking at is a cymatic pattern. And the cymatics is essentially the study of sound frequencies when they interact with physical substances. In this case, what you're looking at here is the sound frequency hitting water, flash frozen by a strobe camera at 10,000ths of a second. Sacred geometry and sound combined in one image. Now, we're very grateful for a man in Switzerland who, for many years during the 20th century, decided to actually create a laboratory and look at the way that sound interacts with physical substances, especially if I get this to work. Yes, it does. Fantastic. This is some of his work. Hans Jenny, a wonderful Swiss gentleman who died in the 1970s, took most of his life to find out how sound works in the physical world. And his whole library of information shows us this relationship, especially when it starts working in vibrational essences and geometric shapes. And Jenny's library of information basically gave me the clue that I was looking for the connection to crop circles and how they're formed. Because when I moved to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I was working on the promise of sound, it turns out that the man who inherited Hans Jenny's library of information ends up living a couple of miles away from me. What are the chances of this stuff happening? So when I was able to look through Jenny's experiments, suddenly I began to see that there were certain visual representations of crop circles in the actual work. And when I began to look at the way that Jenny had worked in his laboratory, I discovered that when he was taking simple frequencies, he would get shapes like this, simple circles with rings, which reminded me very much of the early years of the modern crop circle phenomenon. Because in Britain, we too began with simple circles, circles with rings, which then mutated into much more geometric shapes and, of course, into the complex fractal patterns that we have today. Well, one day, when I was looking through all this information, I came across something very, very startling, which I know you're going to work. There you are. I came across this. And this is where I went, oh, Susanna, where have I seen this before? Because what was happening here was that Jenny began to experiment with the layering and the building up of frequencies in the laboratory. And as the frequencies became much more complex and higher, so the complexity of the geometric shape went up in complexity relative to the actual dispensed frequency. And suddenly I had a relationship because we had been measuring this on the land as well. So one day when I was trawling through this library of information, I came across a crop circle actually as a sound frequency in Jenny's library. And as you can see, the connection is quite unmistakable. Tetrahedrons captured with sound, and a tetrahedron that came up in a field in England as well. A very famous one too. And it wasn't just an isolated case. I mean, it was one case after another after another. And the relationship in terms of complexity certainly was there. At this particular time, I began to look at the work of a woman in America called Valerie Hunt in California. She'd been mapping out the human body and all its range of frequencies, among other people. And she discovered that among the huge myriad of range of frequencies that inhabit this wonderful vessel of ours, is the fact that in the middle of all this range, something is missing. And she found that between the frequencies of 260 to 320 megahertz, there is nothing happening in the human body, completely blank. No one knows why. And I wanted to know why, because I was learning all of this from scratch as I was going. At the same time, I came across the work of a young man in England called Paul Weigay, who'd been walking around the fields of England as a skeptic. And he walked into a crop circle one day on his cell phone to his dad. And he walked into a kind of unusual shape, kind of like this one I have up here. And he was walking down the tractor lines, and he was talking to his dad. And the moment he walked into the circle, the signal dropped from his cell phone. And he thought, oh, that's interesting. I must have hit a dead spot in the field. So he walked out. He got a signal. He said, Dad, yeah, I'm in a field. These crop circles, yeah, it's all a bunch of jokes, a bunch of pranksters. And he walks in here again. Dad, there's no signal. And he thought, that's unusual. Let me walk around to see if I have a dead spot somewhere in this field. So he walks around in this sort of circular area, and there's nothing happening. Well, what he was in is this complex geometric shape. And no matter where he walked inside the shape, he got no signal frequency at all. Suddenly he realized he was actually working inside a magnetic field or some kind of shielding device that was not just a dead spot in the middle of a valley. And that's when he became an admitted crop circle researcher, and it has done to this day. So he comes from a very skeptical background, completely turned around by experience. He actually designed his own gizmo, which he takes with him, and it reads electromagnetic frequencies, background frequencies, anywhere on Earth. So if he came into this room right now, and he'd walk around with this gizmo, he'd probably be measuring 180 megahertz, because we're all surrounded by this wonderful, and sometimes not so wonderful, electromagnetic soup we live in today. What he began to notice was that whenever he walked into fields, suddenly whenever he crossed the perimeter of the flattened crop circle, the frequencies shot through the roof, very noticeably so. But there was a range of frequencies that appeared only inside the crop circles. And at that time, I began to take an interest in his work, and I called him up from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I said, I've got some information here, Paul, which I don't know what to do with, and I think you may have an answer to this. And he said, yeah, I've got stuff which I've been working with in England, and I don't know what to do with it either. And I said, yeah, I've been reading about this. And he says to me, well, come over for a pint of beer and, we'll talk about this. I said, well, I can't. I'm over in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And he says, well, that's coincidental, because I live in Portsmouth, Hampshire, in England. They said that coincidence is God's way of, being invisible. And then he says to me, which street do you live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire? And I said, Orchard Street. And don't tell me. I said, yes, I live right across from Orchard Street in Portsmouth, Hampshire. We'd better work together. I said, yes, absolutely. These things happen all the time. It's quite funny. Anyway, the collaboration was very fruitful, because when I began to look at Paul's range of frequencies in crop circles, it turns out that his range of frequencies inside the crop circles, more often than not, was the frequency range 260 to 320 megahertz. exactly the range that was missing in the human body. And suddenly the hairs on all our hands and chest combined began to rise very dramatically, because suddenly we went, oh, Susanna. No wonder people are having heightened states of awareness, raised consciousness, healings. These things are inputting something into the human body, or waking something which is lying dormant in our own body. Something very dramatic is happening, and we've really hit something. Well, today, the frequencies are also going up, and so, incredibly enough, is the complexity of the designs. Just like in the laboratory with Hans Jenny's experiments, where the applied frequency, the applied sound frequency in the laboratory, captured in film, is also at the rate of frequency that's applied to the design. In other words, the complexity seems to match the rate of frequency applied. And again, we're finding this in the fields in England in the year 2000, where we started to hit 640 megahertz, and the frequency is going up dramatically as well. Interestingly, clairvoyants have also maintained, or in fact they've always maintained, that it is the stepping up of frequency of vibration which enables energy from another dimension to pop through as information, because it is by this process that changes in brainwave patterns occur. Very interesting stuff. That was said back in 1905, by the way, by Madame Blavatsky, of all people. Now, you may be wondering what my cat Pickle has to do with the research into crop circles. This is a very important story, and I hope you all pay attention to this one. This is why I take a break from talking. I tend to babble on, or Babylon as they used to call it. If you ever get this crazy notion to get involved in deep research and spend all the hours of the night burning the midnight oil, don't get yourselves a $40 wrist rest. You know, there's horrible things that have gel in them, you know, you buy them from Staples and things like that. Invest in a 13-pound grey calico, because they sit on your lap obediently all night, and you can sit there using them as a wrist rest, just like this. And the movement of your tendons are such that she feels like she's being played with and massaged all night. And she looks up at you lovingly all night going, Dad, I love you, and then going, I love you too. And she starts purring. And of course, purring, as we know today, is very beneficial for the human nervous system. Yeah? So that's Pickle's involvement in crop circle research. Thank you. I also want to make sure you're still alive. Right, back to the basis of the phenomenon, in case, lest we forget. This anomalous thing here. Even more incredible when it happens in canola, which is very brittle at certain times of the year, and you can step on it and it snaps like celery. Even more incredible when this happens, this effect happens in Canadian corn. And in the Canadian prairie, they actually chemically treat the corn to withstand the prairie winds. So when this effect happens in a few thousand square feet of Canadian corn, you know you're onto something very special. So it seems as if there's a conscious collaboration between the source and the natural elements with which it interacts. Now, let's talk about audible sound for a second and find out what it does, what kind of effect it has on plants, because there is a historical precedent to this, which goes back to 1928 in India. But more importantly and recently, in 1968 in Denver, a woman called Dorothy Retalek began to actually measure the effects on plants. And she found that by placing the plants in different parts of the laboratory and subjecting them to different forms of music, certain things begin to occur in the metabolism of the plants themselves. Now, to kind of very long story short, she found that when she played classical music to plants, she found that the stems began to actually bend over and actually lean towards the speakers from which the classical music was emanating. When she went to the next group of plants and she played them heavy metal, the plants would actually try to run away from the speakers. And in many cases, they're actually dead. Figure that one out. But in the third case, where the music of Ravi Shankar, the Indian sitar player, had been administered for months, the stems had actually bent in excess of 60 degrees to the vertical. Closest I've known any human being achieving the kind of effect we're finding in these wonderful glyphs. So, the minds begged to know, what is so special about Ravi Shankar's music that did this to plants? Well, Ravi Shankar plays something called Indian devotional music, or Indian devotional song, which is very, very sacred. And in fact, like its written counterpart, which is Sanskrit, these are supposed to be the vestiges of the words of God. And the notes of Indian devotional song, like the written expressions of Sanskrit, are unalterable by law. They will chop your hands off if you try to mess about these things. They're very, very serious. Kind of like the Catholic Church in the old days, with making people fast for 3 years, but for other reasons altogether. Kind of interesting. And so I began to figure out that there's something about sound and the metabolism of plants that can do this. So we're on the right path here. And then other connections began to appear as well. We actually began to record auditory sound in crop circles too, and in two very famous cases, one featuring another researcher called Colin Andrews, who just retired recently. He actually went into a field after years of frustration of not having an answer to what was behind all of this. And I still remember the day we talked about this in his house in Connecticut. It's so funny. And I said, so what happened? And I said, well, I had this tape recorder with me quite by luck. And I just punched the heavens and I said, God, tell me how these bloody things are made. And 15 seconds later, he was rewarded with this very unusual trilling sound, which sounded not too dissimilar to a cicada, but much more metallic in origin. Well, someone else recorded this independently during another night watch. And the tapes were sent to 2 laboratories around the world, and one of them was the JPL laboratory in NASA in Pasadena. And the tape was analyzed by a man called Robert Weiss, who was the man who also investigated the Watergate tapes. So we know we can trust him. Okay. Oh God, I've got to keep the politics of 2 countries separate in my head. And he concluded, after looking at the sound of the recorded in this crop circle, that it was not any sound found in nature. And he went through every conceivable form of bird, whale, dolphin, you name it. And he said, it's not birds, it's not whales, it's not dolphins, it's mechanical in origin. And no, it doesn't come from the tape recorder either. And it has a harmonic of 5 kilohertz. That was what the interesting thing was. Well, I began to look at this because when I spoke to Colin 10 years later, I said, you know what? You were given an answer to your question. It's obvious when you think about it. It took us 10 years to think about it. It was that obvious. But it's an obvious clue. And I came across the work of researchers in Canada who actually had experimented with audible sound, as had done the Canadian government and the British government and the American government and the Russian government during the war, to use audible sound to stimulate the growth of wheat, specifically during wartime. And what they found was when they actually played a specific frequency to wheat, that they actually were able to stimulate the growth in wheat and also stimulate a raised heat temperature in the soil. Well, guess what? That's what we found in crop circles too. And the farmers in England will tell you that when they have brand new crop circles on their land, especially when they appear in immature crop, the plants which are subjected to this energy begin to actually outgrow the plants in the rest of the field. We've done the same thing in laboratory tests where we've taken germination tests and found that the crop circle seeds are outgrowing control samples and human man-made crop circle seeds by a huge ratio of over 4 to 1. I'm talking about that after, you can do this in your own gardens if you want. I did this in my own one in England. I planted these seeds in my soil. After about a week, you have wheat sample that looks like this, a man-made circle that looks like this, and the crop circle seed is up to here. You know, every time I take a photograph of these things, the rabbits eat these things. I still have not taken a picture. They do exist. I mean, my rabbits are huge. But they do exist. I mean, they do have the laboratory experiments in the laboratories in Michigan, so I'm not just making this up. But what is unusual is that recently we've taken soil samples to Dartmouth University and also, I believe, UCLA, and we have found that the crystalline structure of the soil has been altered in the crop circles to a point where the laboratory report, and by the way, they didn't know where the soil came from. They had no idea. They concluded that the crystalline structure of the soil sample had been subjected to a huge amount of heat in 1 nanosecond, and it must have been subjected to a huge amount of pressure. They concluded that the only way you could do this is to leave the soil under the ground for about 5 miles and subject it to the Earth's heat for a few thousand years. So you can imagine their surprise when we told them they came from a crop circle topsoil. So the heat of the soil and the growth cycle of the plant is found in the circles. And the connection here that bridges the two gaps together is the fact that the frequency of the audible sound that was used to generate these experiments in Canada and throughout the world was 5 kilohertz. The frequency of the crop circle trilling noise was 5.2 kilohertz. Not a great difference between the two. So now we had audible sound recorded in the crop circle that was leaving vestiges in the plants the same as they had been done in laboratory 30 years before the crop circles had begun to appear. There's a connection between this and also the Aborigines, because when the tape of the crop circle sound was played to them, they reacted in a very emotional manner, and they said, we know this sound. We do this. It's almost very similar to the sound we make when we take the bora, which is a Vesica Pisces-shaped piece of wood, sacred geometric shape, put a string on it, and we whirl it across our heads. And it does create a noise not dissimilar to that sort of trilling noise. And they were asked, why do you do this? And they said, well, we do this to contact the sky spirits. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? And yes, crop circles have appeared in Aboriginal grounds in Australia as well. So I began to look at this further and further, because the clues were now really beginning to pile up. And this is where I began to look at the work of ultrasound and infrasound. In other words, sound above and below the human hearing range. And this is where a fertile territory began to open up, because one of the first things I discovered was that the physical evidence itself of the crop circles suggested that ultrasound certainly was involved, because for one, the higher the frequency used in ultrasound, the greater its ability to form increasingly complex patterns, which of course matches the historical rise in the frequency of the crop circles, which is going up season by season relative to the complexity of the actual shapes. Now, ultrasound is very interesting because it can actually be focused like a light beam to create very fine detail. This is one of the examples. Those little rings there are very little. They're only about 3 inches wide. That's basically the difference between 2 ears of wheat. Now, you cannot even walk a very small child sideways and create those thin rings, which are here, in this particular case, over 800 feet in diameter. That's one hell of a piece of information. The other thing about this wonderful ability of ultrasound to create and generate very fine detail is that it can actually manipulate the molecules of something within an inch of area and leave the next inch next to it completely free of influence. And what you can see here, and I hope you can see this at the back, the crop which had been flattened a week earlier has begun to rise up, back up to the light, which is what it's supposed to do, in a very exquisite fashion. Because what you're seeing here are 96 radial lines emanating from the center. And the way that this has been achieved, and by the way, this is where humans actually have gone in and either created damage or taken soil samples and so forth. What's happened here is that the plants have actually selectively risen back up to the light along specific nodes. In other words, each one of these plant stems has nodes or knuckles along which it is allowed to raise itself back up to the light. So what's happened here is that a portion of plants has raised itself back up on the first node of the plant. The second group of plants beside them has raised itself along the second node, and so on. So if you're sitting in the ground, what you're seeing is a sine wave. It's like an oscilloscope, like sound when it's put through an oscilloscope. And look at what else is happening here. 14 ripples of energy, just like the dowsing maps I showed earlier. Now, that is a lot of very, very high selective ability to do that to plants, to get them to do that. They just don't do that in normal life. Plant biologists are totally stymied by this. The other evidence behind ultrasound is the fact that it works in the megahertz frequency range, which is exactly the kind of frequency range that Paul Weige has been detecting inside the genuine circles. And what is instrumental here is that the megahertz frequency range affects brainwave patterns. In other words, it influences psychological states and it alters states of awareness. And this is precisely the thing that people are experiencing inside crop circles. I can't seem to feel straight. My left brain is shut down. It's always a pull to the right intuitive side. And I cannot tell you the amount of times that I've been embarrassed to go into these things and do simple measurements and simple counts from 1 to 10. And after 4, you're on 7. It's almost embarrassing. You sometimes have to go back. And there was one in 2003, which is so strong. My colleague and I had to go back there 5 times just to figure out why it was that the measurement of the big circle was smaller than the small circle. It's almost embarrassing. You have to keep going back over time when the energy begins to dissipate and your left function begins to operate properly. This is what's happening here. The other thing about ultrasound is it also prevents damage to sensitive tissues. And again, this is now today used in healing in hospitals around the world. And again, we find a lot of connections in the tradition of the crop circles where people are actually experiencing healing in association with them. Perhaps the ultrasound is part of that equation. People who even ingested the seeds from a crop circle have found that retinal tumors, 99% malignant, had disappeared within 2.5 months of ingesting the seeds. That is quite incredible stuff. Again, the Aborigines have a story behind this, because when they actually play the didgeridoo over broken bone, they find that within a few days, the actual crystalline structure of the bone has fused itself back together, which is why today modern hospitals are using ultrasonic frequencies to heal bone as well, because when they found that when they put the didgeridoo in a laboratory, put a mic inside it, they found, oh my God, it's full of ultrasonic frequencies. This is why when you go into a hospital today and you've got a plaster cast, they'll put a hole in there, they'll put an ultrasonic device in there. So this is all old, new information that's popping up here. This is one of my favorite stories. And one of those conclusive things that tells you that ultrasound is very much present. This is a crop circle that was actually commissioned to be made by Arthur C. Clarke when he hired 5 field artists. I call them criminals or hoaxers. And he hired 5 field artists to go into a field and make this small but pretty 5-petal flower. Just to give you an idea of how the inability at the time of humans to understand the concepts behind crop circles, the white lines actually show the actual geometry of the man-made design. The black lines show you exactly where the harmonics ought to be if it was a real genuine circle. So it shows you it's not that easy. Since we've printed all this information, by the way, the hoaxers are now using these better designs, so they're making better designs as a result. So we've actually improved the quality of the hoaxing that's going on. And yes, it does exist still. But anyway, back to Arthur. This is a strange man who I had a lot of respect for, who wrote 2001, where a mysterious, well, what will you describe it? Object, artifact is found on the moon, which leads to higher consciousness, who then goes on to make a program for the Discovery Channel debunking a mysterious monolith on Earth, which is leading inevitably to higher consciousness. I've never understood it. Someone explain it to me one day. Anyway, Arthur basically hired a piece of land in Wiltshire, and he set about getting these people to make this crop circle to prove to the world that the whole thing was a big joke. Well, he got the services of the farmer who came in. The farmer had had many crop circles on his land for many years, and he actually happened to pick on the wrong guy, because this farmer was one of those rare people nowadays that pays attention to birds, animals, seeds, the way that things work on the land. And he knows when it's going to snow, when it's going to rain, when there's going to be a drought, just by watching the way that seeds work and the way that animals behave. And when Arthur C. Clarke invited the farmer to look at his handiwork, the farmer said, this is not like the ones I get on my land. For one thing, you've damaged all the crop. The ones on my land, they're not damaged. I mean, the seeds are aligned like a museum display case. They're beautiful. Nothing's undamaged. And the other thing, Arthur, is the fact that on your little design, all the crows are already helping themselves to all the crop, all the seeds that are lying on the ground. And Arthur quite rightly would have pointed out, well, obviously, we've knocked the seeds out of the seed heads. The crows aren't going to stand on top of a stem of wheat and fall down. They're helping themselves to all these wonderful, easy pickings. And the farmer says, well, that's interesting, because on the circles that I have on my land, that doesn't happen. Because when I see birds flying in formation, this is a genuine circle, by the way, that appeared on the same land years later, when the birds fly over the crop circles, they break formation around them, as if there's a tube of energy around them. And the other thing, Arthur, is that even after I've plowed the field, a month after it's been plowed, and the seeds are all scattered everywhere, the birds don't go anywhere near that area, which brings me back to the concept of ultrasound, because don't we use ultrasonic devices in airports to scare the birds away from airplane engines? There you go. So the energy field in the circles appears to stay there for some time, even after the physical patterns disappeared, which is something that farmers and even anybody, and even Paul with his sensitive equipment, can pick up. The energy and frequency of the crop circle will be there up to 5 years after the physical design has disappeared. That's quite a lot of energy. And of course, ultrasound has also been discovered in stone circles of all places. So there's that connection again to ancient sacred sites. Now, I want to bring you now to another concept here, which is infrasound. That is sound below the human hearing range of 20 hertz. At this level of frequency, sound does some very bizarre things. It begins to disrupt physical substances to the point where it can actually alter chromosomes. This is where I began to realize what I was working with, because here you have a slide showing a control sample of wheat under a microscope, showing how the actual chromosomes of the plant had been altered inside the crop circle to a very dramatic and obvious degree. That was the first clue that infrasound was doing something here and very much present. Because the other clue was that infrasound is capable of generating heat to 1500 degrees Celsius in a fraction of a second, which brings us to the point about the physical evidence. Because if you have this kind of energy affecting natural elements like wheat and barley and so on, you'd expect that kind of frequency and energy to have visible effects. And it does. Because when you're creating the acoustic power generated by infrasound, which could be anywhere up to 500 atmospheres of pressure, when you begin to actually throw infrasound at any object which is filled with water, you begin to boil the water inside the object. This has already been done in laboratories at Princeton, UCLA, and so on. What you're seeing here is the same experiment done in a field, in a crop circle. This is an extreme example where you see how the plants in their genuine design show an incredible amount of heating, where the discoloration and even burning and charring of the stem has actually taken place at the root level, and also around the node, to the point where it's not only burnt the stem, it's also elongated the knuckle of the plant beyond normal parameters. This is something that's been validated by William Levengood, the physician who's been looking at these for 15 years. What you're seeing here, basically, is that the water inside the stems, the liquid-filled stems of a plant, is boiled in 1 fraction of a second, in 1 nanosecond. And when it does so, if you ever try to basically boil a kettle to make a cup of tea, you know that the water, when it's boiled, it has to expand. And inside the plant of a crop circle, that water has to locate the most sensible part of the plant for which to escape, and that is the plant's fibrous node. And you can see here another very good example of a genuine circle where the water has blown from inside the plant and escaped outwards, just like the film Alien, without the side effects. Because the other thing that happens here is that when you have the amount of heat subjected to the plant is made supple at the base. Can you imagine all the water has been sucked out of the stem? The plant is now top-heavy with its seed. At the base of the stem, all that heating has made the plant very supple, and the plant falls over and bends. And then, in 1 flash of a second, that plant is made to reharden in its new and horizontal position. Because when you try to bring the plants back up in the genuine designs, they will snap right back down again. And this is something that was noted back in 1890, when the superstitious farmhands reported going into devil's circles, putting in their pitchfork to try and raise the hay, as they call it in those days, and realizing that everything began to spring back down again, not because of the weight, but because the plants were rehardened along the horizontal scope. And what they also found, that anything that was metallic that they took inside the crop circles magnetized itself and began to discharge electrical charges. This is back in 1890. Incredible stuff. So now we have this scenario that has been presented here. This scenario where it is conceivable that the crop circles are influencing biological systems, the energy grid of the Earth, even the people who come into contact with them. And it's a very, very rapid process. We have rare daylight occurrences of crop circles appearing, some reported by farmers saying that they report a tube of light coming down in front of them, manifesting a swirl pattern in the crop less than 200 yards away from them. This is back in 1965, before anyone ever put the words crop and circle together in the same sentence. Recently, in 1996, we have a situation in Stonehenge. One Sunday afternoon, hundreds of people milling around this wonderful sacred site, 35 feet above the fields where this thing suddenly appeared within a 15-minute window of time in broad daylight, witnessed by the guards that go all the way around this monument to make sure that no one's trying to get in without paying. They go around roughly every 15 minutes, and 1 minute there was nothing there. The next 15 minutes later, it was. Same thing with pilots flying over this particular airspace to the local airbase. 5:15 in the afternoon, no one reported anything. 15 minutes later, next pilot, all you could hear him say, "What the hell is that down there?" And there was a huge traffic jam suddenly piled up all along one of England's busiest southern routes. 15 minutes is all it took. Well, 15 seconds seems to be the witness point of view. 80 eyewitnesses around the world to this date, all as far away from England as British Columbia, all report seeing the crop circles appearing in less than 15 seconds, which is precisely what was captured one day on tape. And in fact, I was very pleased to see this in the Metaphysical Library. There is a video there called Crop Circle Communicate. It's a very, very rare video, which incorporates a very rare occasion when a Japanese TV crew actually caught on camera a crop circle manifesting at the very edge, the very limit of the capacity of their television equipment. This is 2 weeks after the English military had staged a hoax event in front of the world's media, which survives to this day as the piece of evidence that basically took out the entire phenomenon. Yet 2 weeks after this event, the Japanese camera crew caught a swirl motion at the very edge of the field of the equipment, suggesting that whoever was behind all of this wanted just to reassure you that they were still alive and well and to keep the faith. It does make you wonder. I'll say that this tape is very rare because the Japanese TV crew, by contract with the BBC, had to hand over the tape, and the BBC lost it. Imagining losing the tape of the assassination of Kennedy is akin to that kind of thing. And also the whole thing, the whole sequence of scenario, the tape, the entire sequence of events was given a demilitary notice by the British military, which is the highest level of secrecy. So clearly they wanted to make sure this is all kept under wraps. I have a little treat for you, which is coming up. I hope it's coming up because I put it in here somewhere. I know it's in here somewhere. Let's see. There is definitely an external source involved with all of this, because people keep talking about balls of light. Watch the top right-hand corner of this and see what happens. See that ball of light? There it is. And it's going to speed up very, very quickly. There it goes. There it is, right there. This is the kind of stuff that we keep finding in England all the time. The farmers talk about them as balls of light about this big, incandescent. People have talked about them as fairy lights, will-o'-the-wisp, etc. My own pilot in England has seen this, and he didn't believe me. He kept talking to me about, what's all this thing about balls of light and creating crop circles? They're always in the vicinity of the crop circles or the sacred space. And I explained to him, I said, yeah, they're following the magnetic lines of energy, and sometimes they're involved in some way in the crop circle making process to a degree which I don't know. But they're always around, and they're always around the sacred space, as if they're part of a living, conscious, breathing thing. And at that moment, in broad daylight, past a hill called Golden Ball Hill, my pilot and I sat there in a microlight watching a ball flying below us at 100 feet, and the two of us, and this is almost like a cartoon, we just went. And I kept banging his head saying, follow that light. I said, no, I can't. We haven't got enough fuel, I'm going to crash. And he says to me, okay, I totally understand why you gave up your house and your marriage to do this. Just don't mention this back at the airfield to the boys. I don't want people to know. That's the fear factor involved, the ridicule factor. It's quite strong. But you can see here that these balls are being captured more and more on film every day now. And there's definitely some kind of external source involved, not just the beams of light, which I want to talk about right now quite quickly. In fact, I might even have... No, I don't. Okay. You might be able to see this from here. There's a color plate in my book if you want to take a look afterwards. It shows two perpendicular beams of light coming into a field. When I took this photograph, I actually didn't see these beams in front of me. I just took this shot of this, in fact, a very boring photograph across the hills of Wiltshire without even realizing what was there, and kicking myself afterwards for taking such a ridiculous, stupid, bad picture, until I got the film back. Now, I've been a professional photographer for many years. I know anomalies in film when I see them. I know camera problems when I see them. And this was sent to Kodak, and they said, well, you've caught sunlight. And I said, well, no, I haven't, because if anybody's ever tried to photograph sunlight, it's very rare to get perpendicular beams, even if you're pointing the camera straight at the sun. And today, the sun was already way over here, you know. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was pointing in the wrong direction. So it didn't make any sense to me at the time. And the next day, I went to the research facility, the pub, and I sat down, and I always try to maintain a very low profile, because I like to get very good information from people, especially local people in Wiltshire when I lived there, because that way it becomes more uncontaminated. Once people start realizing what I do for a living, they might start to fiddle the information a little bit, and in this way they don't feel the need to, you know, aggrandize the information. And on this particular afternoon, the day after this picture was taken, a woman came by and sat next to me, and she said, the weirdest thing happened yesterday, and I needed someone to talk to about it. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? I'm a neighbor. She says to me, well, I was out walking by a field called Torsmead Copse. We name everything weird in England in case we get invaded, I think. You know, anybody invades Britain, no one knows where they're going. Torsmead Copse, what is Torsmead? I have no idea. And Torsmead Copse basically is a copse of wood. It's a wood, and it surrounds a big wheat field there. And she said to me, I was walking by the copse, as I usually do, and my dog started barking at air. He started jumping 3 feet up into the air, little Jack Russell. He never does that. And he was trying to bite something that was invisible. And then a few seconds later, I saw, and I said, I swear, I said, go on. I saw a tube come down like a cookie cutter out of the clouds and swirl the top of the wheat head there. And then it went back 15 seconds later. And I walked there today, and you'd never believe what's on that exact spot. And I said, yeah, I was just there. It's a great big 7-pointed star crop circle. And I said, what time of the day were you actually out there seeing the beam of light? And she says, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when I usually go out for my walk. And I said, that's funny. Here's a picture I shot yesterday, 10 miles away, of Torsmead Copse, with a beam of light coming down at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You can't make this stuff up if you wanted to. Unbelievable. And I said, I didn't even see this stuff when I took the picture, you know. In fact, a nice girl I was kissing at the time, I had to drop her on the floor and take the picture and then go, what did I do that for? That was dumb. But it is strange. And again, she doesn't talk to me anymore, but what the hell. But what is interesting is that I don't think we're actually seeing beams. I think we're actually seeing a loop. And again, people have talked about this, where they see a beam come down, but nothing happens until 24 hours later, as if there are 2 processes going on here. One, where crop circles are actually made by a beam or a ball of light or some other form of consciousness, which people have seen, and it imprints the Earth right there and then. And then there's a second point where the crop circle manifests later from below the ground, as if whatever information is coming into the Earth is waking up some kind of information that's already in this living organism called the Earth. And what's happening here, because we think in terms of linear, being humans, what's happening here is actually a loop. It's a feedback loop. One's going in and one's going out, because the same thing happens at Stonehenge. If you've ever been to Stonehenge, great big rocks next to a great big mound next to it, but no one ever pays attention to the mound, except the mound, when it was doused, turns out it's the battery that supplies Stonehenge with a spiral cord of energy that goes into the center of the site. So what we're seeing here is the same feedback principle, I believe, anyway. So this brings us, of course, to the implication, because an incredible implication, because the light spectrum, since we're now talking about light, the light spectrum carries the signals that organisms require for receiving information, particularly human DNA. Hello, hello, where have we seen this before? Now, Greg Braden, a wonderful researcher who wrote a book called 0 Point, Returning to 0 Point, something like that. Anyway, I wish I'd written it years before I began to write my own book, because it would save me a lot of time, because we came to quite similar concepts about the crop circles, even though he really wasn't studying the subject. It just happened to have moved into his area of influence. And what he was looking at was human DNA and how it's being influenced, and perhaps being influenced in a way that's waking our souls up to a new level of awareness. And when he took a look at this particular and very bizarre crop circle, which most people thought was an aberration of nature, it looked like someone had gone with a cosmic stick and suddenly went, yeah. But the actual way that the crop was laid was totally conformance to the genuine phenomenon, as were the anomalies. And what Braden saw in this bizarre design spoke to him very personally, because for him, it showed that it matched the strategic breaks in human DNA, which are waiting to be coded. Hello, hello, where have we come across this before? What he did was he took the actual breaks as a percentage of the whole design, and he applied these strategic breaks and matched them to the points in our human DNA molecule which are not coded for protein. In other words, they're either sitting there where nothing is happening, and as he pointed out, God doesn't just make things and then leave blanks, unless, of course, they're there blanks because they're waiting to be activated by an external force. These are the consequences, I believe now, of this incredible phenomenon, which is encoding the Earth, and I believe may also be encoding an imprint in people which is helping us to reestablish ourselves with divine concepts and principles at a time, I repeat this, at a time we are in most desperate need of this connection. And before I forget this, I always forget this important point. The jump at the end of this 4,000-year connection that I began this talk on is now. We are within this jump to the next level of awareness, and it requires not just everybody on the planet to have this new level of awareness to achieve that jump. It requires a critical mass. It may be 51%, it may be 30%, I don't know. But I do know from the sources that I work with that we are this far from achieving critical mass. So do not give up the hope. There are thousands, millions of people, like everybody here in this room, doing exactly what we're doing, thinking the same way, working quietly under the radar. It does work. And the more people that are coming into the system, the more that critical mass is achieved. And before anybody has a chance to say Iraq, we're going to hit that critical mass, and we're going to turn the whole thing to where we need to be. God help us. Actually, no, let's... Thank you. In fact, the Hopi have a very good way of expressing it. We're the ones we've been waiting for. They have a good sense of humor. You got to laugh about this, otherwise you go nuts. To bring this down to earth a little bit, in case you think this is all theoretical, I was looking at some information in China and looking at how they've been working with bioelectromagnetism, and I discovered that apparently, such bioelectromagnetic signals that are working with this kind of DNA structure and an influencing of the DNA structure, such bioelectromagnetic signals actually operate at the extreme ends of the electromagnetic spectrum, which turns out to be the ends of the spectrum where we are actually figuring out happening in the crop circles themselves. Now, the Chinese say that any excitation of this bioelectromagnetic field is transmitted to the DNA, and in laboratory experiments in China, genetic information has already been successfully transmitted from one organism to another. If these things are organisms and we're organisms, it doesn't take much of a logical gap to figure out the connection that's happening here. So the implications of the crop circles and their influencing of information on Earth and all its living organisms are very, very dramatic, especially when you consider that they have the missing frequencies of the human electromagnetic field as well. So we can begin to perhaps appreciate, I'm going ahead of myself here, that the crop circles, the cathedrals, and the ancient temples, they're all built on the strategic points of the Earth's electromagnetic grid. In fact, I'll go back one before I do my shameless publicity. They all appear to be built upon the strategic points of the Earth's electromagnetic grid. They are founded on the principles of sound and sacred geometry, and all such vibrations have a sympathetic effect on the molecular structures because all the atoms that make up the physical world, including the human body, are themselves in a state of vibration. And again, this is all happening at the crossover of a 4,000-year evolutional cycle whose time is now. So, this is all part of the waking process of humanity. What I described tonight basically is about 1% of what's in my head and what's in my book. So if you want to take this stage further, I brought a few copies of my book along. I forgot to mention this at the beginning, and people always kill me for this. The bulk of the information that I give you today, or the general essence of the information, is actually encoded in a DVD, which is also at the back. Except the big difference is, instead of having me looking like Sean Connery, is that good? I'd love him to do a thing on crop circles. Can you imagine? We're going to discuss crop circles. It'd be priceless. The DVD basically is the essence of what I discussed today, but instead of having me sitting up there on a throne talking to you with slides, it's actually shot live with all the sacred sites in England, the Gothic cathedrals, and some aerial footage of crop circles. I am told from the people who review this in Nexus magazine that, and I quote, I could have been mistaken that I was watching a BBC documentary, so that's great praise indeed. It's also the cheapest trip you'll ever have to the British Isles, and our gas is $7.50 a gallon. So it is the cheapest trip you'll ever have to England, believe me. So that's my shameless commercialization and exploitation. Before I sort of conclude, I'm going to leave you with some homework, by the way. I got to thank, there's so many people here who are involved with this process, and particularly Bridget Tyler, who saw me speak in Nevada and then said, you better come up to Oregon. I said, absolutely. But so many people here who've given me the opportunity to come here and speak. So I really want to thank them and all the people at the back who've coordinated all this, anybody who's actually involved in the running of the process. So, please, these things take a lot of coordination, a lot of work, a lot of effect on the human nervous system, and luckily so many people have showed up today. I think it's really worth it. So if you'd like to join me in a round of appreciation for these people, thank you. Wherever you are. Thank you.
Take some questions.
You fancy some questions? Oh, yeah, there's always one.
If you'd like to ask questions, please come up to the microphone here.
Would you say that it's a fair statement that theoretically the formation of the ancient pyramids used sound technology, and that the weight of these tremendous blocks of granite, for example, I know that some of them are 80 tons each, somehow shifted and they were able to be moved because the molecular structure changed and they did not weigh as much? Is that a fair statement?
That's my understanding, yeah. Because if you look at the amount of quartz in the rock used for the Great Pyramid, the ancestors were also not just teachers, but they were scientists of sound. And they were able to figure out that, as I said before, with the Freemasons, which came from the Egyptian quarries, that's why they were Masons, they were able to figure out that there was a molecular vibration to each rock, an organism. They were able to understand how each rock had its frequency, and by throwing the frequency in terms of sound back at the rock, it reversed the actual molecular structure of the rock, and it made them weightless. So when they put the rocks on this conveyor belt called magnetic lines of energy, all they had to do was this. That's my understanding. Same thing happened in Stonehenge as well. Yeah, totally agree. X marks the spot.
He knows me all
There's
too
a large
well.
piano over your head, by the way.
I know. He says, keep it short. He knows me all too well. I will. Two things. One is, you mentioned that putting a glass of water on a specific crop circle picture had healing effects. Which crop circle picture? And is it in your book, or can you tell us which ones? And the other thing is, this is just my personal opinion. I don't think you can be an expert on crop circles without having actually experienced them directly. In other words, been there and done that. That's my opinion, and I wanted yours.
I even got the T-shirt.
Good.
I've been there, done that, got the T-shirt, had the experiences, and in one case, I won't go into it, it's a huge story, I actually got levitated inside one of them, and that wasn't my intent to actually go there and do that. Oh yes, I've lived there and breathed it, that's for sure. It wasn't an armchair research. In terms of the healing with the crop circles, I'm just getting involved into this now. I allude to this in my book, but I know so much more now about that aspect. There is no specific crop circle that will heal, but each one of them carries a frequency, as I've been discussing today. Each one carries a frequency code, which the person that is afflicted with a specific problem can actually pick for themselves. The healer does not actually choose the picture. It's very important that the person who's afflicted chooses the picture, because they are an organism in need of healing, and they will react very emotionally to a specific image, and that is the one for them. To cut a very long story short, I was trying to actually write this over the winter in a little booklet for my website, which is this. You'll find all this on there. What you do is, you take the picture, you rotate the picture as a healer, and you ask to find the critical rotation point of the picture. At that point, you lock the image of the crop circle into the Earth's magnetic field. This is very, very important, because now you make it alive. All the pictures that I put in my book, I have noted what are hoaxed and what, and there's very few of them on there, just to make the point. A lot of them are genuine, and I've also not stretched the pictures along the X or the Y axis. In other words, once you manipulate the picture, you've messed up the frequency. And I've done that to my book, where every one of them maintains that frequency for that reason, so people can use them. What you then do when the picture is alive, you take a vial of spring water, preferably like a Bach flower remedy, the rescue remedy, and you put it on top of the picture and you feel a hot spot, and then literally you ask that the energy of the crop circle in its pure form be transformed to the water for the highest good of the person taking it. And that's all you do. You take your ego out of it and your judgment or your outcome, because you don't know what the person is going to require for their healing. They might need to die as a form of healing. They might need to experience the illness in order to have the experience. You just don't know. Only the person knows. And in many cases, people are being healed. But that's, in essence, how they work. They don't have a specific healing pattern. They just have the information which the body needs and chooses for itself. But I will be writing on this, and I'll post up the information as soon as I can, because I feel that there's a lot of interest in this in my last few talks.
A couple more questions. I just want to remind people that the books and videotapes are available, DVDs are available at the table back there.
If we run out, by the way, if you go on my website, you can get them from my website as well. And just remember, if you go to Amazon, I only get 10%. As do all the other authors as well. Support your local author. Go directly.
Okay, this man.
Hi. It seems to me there's a high level of intelligence and awareness and organization behind the crop circles. Do you have any sense you can speculate about the source of that awareness, or?
Yes, I've always dread this question, and I never had a good answer for it, because when I talk about the origin of the crop circles, for me to just come out with this cold, it sounds very sensational. The whole chapter 13 in the book discusses the actual psychic connection to the crop circles, and the fact that a woman in England named Isabel Kingston began to unintentionally channel the source, and she's been in contact with them ever since, and she's predicted what they're going to look like, where they're going to be, and when. We've done this over the years. Some of these we knew exactly where they're going to be. And the source, and again, you'll have to take this at face value, because I can't give you the background to all of this. The source, it seems, ironically, goes back to the ancient Egyptians. It's a group consciousness called the Watchers. That's what they call themselves, because they can only watch, they can't intervene, they can only give you information. And they're implementing the information for the waking up of humanity to its greater responsibility. And when you go back in history, you find that the Watchers are referenced as the Shining Ones in Egypt, and also as the Netters, the Neteru, the creator gods. And that's essentially who is behind the core principle of the crop circles, because as I am now told, through some of the channelings that I've attended, there are not just the Watchers involved, there are other groups of consciousness, some are physical, most of them are not physical at all, and they're all here with their own particular agenda, and I mean that in a good way, giving information into the Earth for the Earth's actual organism to evolve and to stop it from destroying us, because the Earth is sitting there going, I need to get these people off my back, they're killing me. And I know it sounds crass, but it's absolutely true. And also, the information is also helping to wake people up. And this goes back to 20 years ago, before it was all proved that it's actually coming true. So it is a universal consciousness that's behind it, just not very physical.
Hi, you mentioned Serpent Mound in Ohio.
Yeah.
That's my old neighborhood, so I wondered what had been going on in that area.
If you go on my website, behind me, you go to the link section, there is one which goes to the American crop circle research site. I think it's cropcirclenews.com. Wonderful man. I think he spoke here a while ago, Jeffrey Wilson. He's been documenting all that's been happening because he lives right next to Serpent Mound.
Oh, okay.
You'll get all the information you need from him.
Okay.
Because he's got all the data for the American stuff.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Nice guy as well. Looks like Kevin Bacon.
Freddy Silva's website is also linked off the RVML site if you aren't able to write it down. Ilea.
Other than the piano. There's an X here, by the way. This is what the joke is. Never mind.
X marks the spot. This is the one you were talking about, right? I wanted to know if they harvested the crops and if they made any food out of them and if they did
Oh,
any...
yes.
And have people had any results from that, or?
It's going into the food chain, that's for sure. It's made into bread. God knows what happens. But I'll tell you a very funny anecdote where people ingested the seeds from a crop circle in Wiltshire. They went to California. They called back and they said, we've shorted all the equipment, all the electrical equipment in the office. Everybody that had ingested the seeds shorted the computer equipment. So we sent them another batch of seeds, same thing happened. And then we sent them a third batch of seeds and nothing happened. And they said, well, it must have been a fluke. And I said, no, the third batch of seeds were normal seeds.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Don't go near computers.
Hi, you talked about the electromagnetic fields within the crop circles. Have you investigated the effect of the electromagnetic fields created not by nature, but by humans, like cell phones and computers and such on humans?
Yeah, not to the same degree because of the lack of funding, and also because, I mean, it has been looked at in terms of people actually making crop circles who are actually hired for that reason. And you've dowsed around it, we've actually dowsed the magnetic field, the electric field as well, and we find that there is no relationship at all, unless your intent makes it so. I've been in actual crop circles which I know made by people, I even know who've made it, and they were actually prosecuted afterwards. And there was no energy evident there that was related to the actual physical design. When I went in, and then I applied my own will to create and implement my own energy field into that design, I was then able to douse my own energy field rippling out. But it bore no resemblance to the actual physical connection to the crop circle. In other words, it didn't match the actual physical area which had been flattened. So people using their will can actually create their own organized energy field, but it won't actually ally itself to the actual flattened areas of the crop, which is what we find in the crop circles.
And the other part of that is, what do you feel is the effect of human-made products
On the land?
On humans and the land?
It seems to be psychosomatic. I mean, if you go there with the intent that you're going to be influenced by whatever it is you come into contact with, you will be influenced. And again, it comes down to the intent of whoever's making it. I've actually met people who've made a design. They've paid the farmer for the land, so it's all above board. It's not a criminal activity. And they've gone there with the intent to actually communicate with the circle makers and actually give back something as an honoring. And I found that the stuff that they make is actually so close to the real phenomenon, it's scary, without all anomalies, but it's so beautifully laid out because the intent is so strong. And I'm trying to make a very long story short. They asked me, and Paul, who works with electric media, I work with dowsing, he works with electronic stuff, so you've got science and the meta-science going on here. We both were able to track down which field out of 6 they were going to work on, and also actually line and map the entire energy fields for that area before and after they had made their design. And guess what? Because of their intent and their allied intent to the actual spirit world, we actually measured the field afterwards and found that the entire grid had began to come close and encompass the design that they actually made. So they were able to influence the local magnetic field as well. But that's their intent. It comes down to intent. It's a very powerful force. Yeah, it's a very good question, actually. I'm going to leave you with some homework before you go away, because there's one thing we haven't talked about yet, which is about water. Funny enough, that in addition to the churches and all the sacred spaces, the crop circles too also share a relationship with water. Case in point, this is an infrared photograph that I took many years ago showing the water displacement in a field, and the white areas show where the water has actually been sucked out of the ground to the point where you'll be walking along one of these tram lines and the soil, which is very clay-like in this part of the world, it actually sticks to your boots, and the moment you walk into the actual crop circle, you can pick it up, put it in your hand, and you can blow it like powder. So an incredible amount of heating has actually taken place here, but it also shows that the crop circles and water share a very interesting relationship, because no matter where they appear, they are also related to the watershed, ponds, rivers, and so forth. And all of these sacred spaces around the world all share this relationship with water. Spin, as we discovered earlier on, creates an electromagnetic field in water, as do the crop circles, which are based on spin and have their own electromagnetic field. And water, incredibly not, has memory. If any of you are into homeopathy here, you'll understand exactly what I mean. The modern heretic, Jacques Benveniste in France, he basically proved that in the modern era, the homeopathy really does hold water, pardon the pun, because when he tried to figure out that if you imprint information in water, that the more you dilute the original structure, the more the information is retained in the memory of the water. No matter how many millions of times the original solution is diluted, it retains the information, and the actual frequency seems to be magnified many times. Now, we know he was right for two very good reasons. One, because he's passed away actually recently, broken heart almost. I think he just basically was hounded to death by everybody. But we know he was right for two reasons. His settings and all his notes and all his experiments were validated by 5 different laboratories across Europe. And 2, because the French authorities shut him down and stole all his papers. And as we know, in the modern era, that assassination by the establishment, regardless of the method, is a sure way of knowing you're on the right path of inquiry. If I get assassinated, you know I was absolutely right. Collecting royalties would be a problem, but I don't care. That's life. So what we did was we sent blind samples to Jacques Benveniste from crop circles for blind tests. He had no idea where they were coming from. And a researcher called Lucy Pringle's basically done this at her expense, at huge expense, by the way. And she began to bury bottles of water all throughout the crop circle, in here, way out in the field and miles away, just to make sure that there was a comparison and a control sample. And what Jacques Benveniste found was that the ones that inevitably came from crop circles were coded 156% above normal control samples. So something about the energy frequency of the circles was imprinting itself in the actual water, which brings us to your homework, because 70% of the world's reported crop circles appear in southern England, the world's deepest chalk aquifer. The other 20% congregate in the Canadian prairie, which is a limestone aquifer. Limestone happens to be the chemical twin of chalk. Now, here's the connection. Because if the water that is actually being encoded in the crop circles is seeping through the groundwater, it's seeping through into the aquifer, it's actually leaching out into the rivers, into the streams, into the oceans and the seas around the world. And by the homeopathic method, the more diluted the original imprint, the stronger it becomes. So the connection is, if the crop circles are encoding the oceans, and the oceans occupy 2/3 the body of the planet, just think what they're doing for you and me, because our body is also 2/3 water. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much for making it.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.